Please, everyone, take your seats so that we can get started. I'm Jonathan Brent, Executive Director of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. I know that many of you are friends of the YIVO Institute, that you know about our history and you know about this project. But some of you don't, and so I'm going to give a kind of general overview, which will perhaps give you some framework for understanding what we're doing and what our plans for the future may be, and perhaps set this conference in a larger context. In the meantime, I want to welcome all of you here today. Amazingly recovered somewhat from the excitement of the last couple of days. Were any of you in Washington? You marched here, yes. So, yes, it was quite amazing, and the future certainly is an anxious one for many of us. And here we are talking about the past, and talking about a past that was equally anxious and filled with much of the same uncertainties, but of course, which resulted in so much disaster. This project, this conference on the history of the Strashun Library, is a conference that represents a part of a larger project of the YIVO Institute and its various partners in Lithuania to reclaim and preserve and to process as much of the documentation of the pre-war YIVO collections as is possible to do at the present time. So in a sense, and the Strashun Library is part of that larger project. The larger project consists of approximately 1.1 million documents, approximately 12,000 volumes. There are brochures about it on the table outside. It's a big 7-year, $5.5 million project. The Strashun Library is one of the core and key components of it. One could say that this project actually began when Max Weinreich sent Lucy Davidovich to Germany after the war to work with the US Army to sort out YIVO materials and materials of other Jewish organizations of Eastern Europe. These materials were returned by the US Army to the YIVO Institute here in New York City. But a portion that no one knew about remained in Lithuania. And in 1989, when the Lithuanian government announced that it had found these materials, or was at least at that point willing to proclaim to the world that it had those materials, people here and people there began to think about what to do with them, who owned them, how to make them known to the world. And this process of deliberation lasted a long time and was, to a certain extent, and it involved many people around YIVO, historians, and in Lithuania, government leaders and so forth. And in the end, the question of ownership proved a rather futile one for us to continue to deliberate. And so in 2013, we conceived the idea of simply bracketing the question of ownership of these materials, hoping that in due course our great-grandchildren or great-grandchildren may resolve them in an atmosphere of mutual trust. But in the meantime, that we would work together with the Lithuanian government and Lithuanian archivists and librarians to do everything we can to preserve the materials, to process the materials, and to digitize them so that those materials in Lithuania and the materials we have here in New York, which would undergo a similar process on this side, could then be linked in a web portal that we will construct for this purpose. You will hear much more about all of this in due course in this conference. For now, I want to restrict myself largely to thanking a lot of people. I want to thank Edward Blank for enabling us to name this project after Edward Blank. And so the project is called the Edward Blank YIVO Vilna Collections Project. I want to thank the team of people at YIVO who are responsible for overseeing every single step of the way of this project. And this team of three is led by Roberta Newman, Lyudmila Sholokhova, and Sarah Paniktera. I want to thank all of our archivists and librarians who have worked with such total and utter dedication for so long to preserve and make these materials available to the public, and among them, foremost, our Fruma Morer, Eddie Goldwasser, Vital Zaika, Aviva Ostrinsky, Tatiana Popova, and the entire team in the archive and library. As I said, we decided to put questions of ownership aside, and we offered our Lithuanian counterparts the opportunity to collaborate on this historic project, and we were delighted to discover that they embraced this opportunity enthusiastically and completely. It is a sign of their truly serious commitment to understanding Jewish history as part of Lithuanian history. And the government, as a sign of this, the Lithuanian government has recently accepted this project as a Lithuanian heritage project of the nation of Lithuania. And therefore, I want to salute and thank the Lithuanian government leaders, the archivists, librarians, and historians who have had the courage and the vision to take this step. In addition, I must add, this project could not have taken place in anything but the imagination of several people, many people perhaps, a community of people, but it would have remained an imaginary project had it not been for the full support, the vision, and the commitment of YIVO's Board of Trustees, and particularly the great goodwill of YIVO's board chairwoman, Ruth Levine, who is with us today, or will be. And with us today, however, is also our board member, Chava Lappin. Chava, please stand up. And Ruth has just entered. I want to thank the YIVO staff who have worked tirelessly to produce the extraordinary exhibit of Strashun Library materials on the second floor mezzanine in the Smart Gallery, which I hope everyone here will have a chance to visit. And I wish to acknowledge the exceptional work of Alex Weiser, the manager of programs, for putting all of this together. Finally, I want to thank our distinguished panel. Many of you have come from all over the United States, from Israel, and from Lithuania to give your presentations today. So thank you for making this journey. And now I want to just say a couple of words about the larger vision of this project within the long-range planning of the YIVO Institute, because this is the beginning of something. It is the beginning, essentially, of YIVO's digital future as an institution that can reach people around the world, from China and Japan to Buenos Aires, Uruguay, the Philippines, Hawaii, and even the state of Idaho. We have found that as we have begun more and more to put our educational programs online, that people from 50 countries around the world and all of the United States have taken part in these programs. And this tells us that there is indeed a strong need in the Jewish world globally for more knowledge, for more context of knowledge, for more presentation of it, and for integrating this knowledge into a bigger narrative of what Jewish history in the East European and Russian diaspora really was about. And this project of ours is the beginning of something that we hope is going to be an online museum, ultimately. One in which these materials from the YIVO Institute in Lithuania and in the United States will be curated by experts, will be set in context, and put in galleries in a museum setting so that people all around the world can see and understand the history that these remarkable materials represent, and which you're going to hear more about today. I won't say more about that, but if anyone is interested in learning more, I do invite you to be in touch, because this is something that is growing here, and I hope that once the Edward Blank YIVO Vilna Collections project has been concluded, that we will move on to the Bund Archive, to the Ansky Archive, and to other archives that require conservation, preservation, digitization, and global dissemination. Thank you very much. So now it's my pleasure to welcome Brad Sabin-Hill to the microphone, our first speaker.
If I knew I would be the keynote speaker, I wouldn't have spent the last 3 hours in the Hollywood Cafe slashing the text. But don't worry, I'll try to keep it to the required limit. Over the years, when I gave regular tours of YIVO's rare book room, it was very easy to feel a chasm between the principally secular Yiddish culture of YIVO and the traditional rabbinic culture of the Strashun collection. Yet that apparent dichotomy is false. As YIVO's founder, the linguist Max Weinreich, demonstrated in his History of the Yiddish Language, unambiguously, it was the derech hashas, his term for the Talmudic and rabbinic tradition, the tradition of study of Hebrew and Aramaic texts, which informed and infused the language as well as the culture of Ashkenazic Jewry over the course of a millennium. Shokle v'tarye kol shekein ma she'ein kein alachas kama v'kama mai kamashmelon drish v'chakira girsa d'yankise havamin mai taima adraba avada mistoma davke kimat psak mekayim brucha klula kasha shaila yontif chuge hilchis shliach dibik melamed talmid gudel apikoiris eshes chayil Judea sefer amoritz gumar kedoshim kiddush Hashem les din v'les dayan Rebbeinu Shalom Hashem Yisborach. This vocabulary, only a tiny fraction of the rich Hebrew and Aramaic component of Yiddish, which was understood not only by the highly literate, yeshiva-educated Yiddish speakers, and which is encountered commonly in the entire corpus of modern and secular Yiddish literature, derives from the ancient and medieval texts, commentaries, and super-commentaries, which are the essence of the Strashun collection. On this 125th anniversary of the opening of the Strashun Library in Vilna, I'd like to speak about some of the oldest books in the collection assembled by Reb Matisyahu Strashun, the collection which, even after the dedication of its new building in the courtyard of the Great Synagogue in Vilna in 1902, was kept in its own separate quarters within the library. This foundation collection of the Strashun Library was never comparable to any of the famous Hebrew collections in the great Western libraries, the Bodleian at Oxford, the British Museum in London, or the Rosenthaliana in Amsterdam. Yet Strashun's library was considerable. The original collection held nearly 6,000 volumes of Hebrew books, or books in Hebrew characters, including some 300 books from the 16th century alone. The catalog of the Strashun Library, published after his death in 1889, shortly before the opening of the public library, was the first printed catalog of an open Hebrew and Jewish library, Hebrew or Jewish library in Eastern Europe, and one of the first catalogs of a Hebrew collection prepared in Hebrew or published by Jews. Let us remember that Vilna was the most important center of Hebrew bibliography in Eastern Europe, and by virtue of the first definitive printed bibliography of Hebrew books, Oitzer Sforim, compiled and published in Vilna, this capital of Lithuanian Jewry could be considered one of the great centers of Hebrew book lore in the world, figuring alongside Oxford, London, and Amsterdam, other centers in Germany, in terms of scholarship on the history of the printed Hebrew book. Strashun was very much aware of these other libraries. He possessed the first catalog of the famous Oppenheim collection from before it was acquired by Oxford, and a number of other catalogs and standard bibliographic works and antiquarian booksellers' lists, on the basis of which we can see how he went about building his library. The Strashun Library eventually held, on the eve of the war, some 400 books printed in the 16th century, which means that 75% of them came from Strashun's original library. The librarian Heike Lunsky drew attention to the broad scope of the collection, which reflected the contribution of rabbinic and the combination of rabbinic and maskilic learning, which characterized Vilna, and Strashun's own personality and predilections, including the Hebrew Bible and its commentaries, both Talmuds, Babylonian and Jerusalem, and their commentaries, midrash, halachic works, philosophy, ethical treatises and sermons, astronomy and mathematics, grammar, medicine, belles lettres, poetry, and illustrated books. And to this list, one might add works of liturgy and liturgical commentary, history, geography, travels, lexicography, letters, folklore, and polemic. The Strashun collection was known to be especially rich in shailas tshuvis, that is, responsa, questions on answers in matters of Jewish law. Lunsky also said that the library held many editions of the classical text so that scholars could pursue their effectively textual studies over the course of the centuries. Without citing specific examples, Lunsky gave a wonderful and almost poetic account of rare editions and unique copies and the difficulty in acquiring them, which is worth quoting in full. And I quote, collecting books is one of the most difficult things. There are books which are like comets, which appear once in hundreds of years and then suddenly disappear. There are others which are unique in the whole world, saved from sundry inquisitions, bans, fires, and carefully guarded from exile to exile from one corner of the world to another. There are others of which no more than a few dozen copies were printed hundreds of years ago. Often, for the sake of a single rare copy, one has to purchase an entire collection. Sometimes one must travel through entire lands until one finds a rare book. And to this difficult task, Reb Matisyahu Strashun dedicated his entire life. You can hear Lunsky's own love of books and libraries and book lore from these lines, in these lines. Over the course of, there were many rare books in the library over the course, printed over the course of 4 centuries. But I'd like to turn now to the oldest books in the collection and their history, the other end of their history. About 14 years after Gutenberg introduced movable type in Europe, in the mid-15th century, Jews adopted this new technology and began to print in Italy, somewhere in or near Rome, around 1470. By 1500, Hebrew books were printed in about 20 towns, first in Italy, then briefly in Spain and Portugal before the expulsions, and finally in Constantinople, that is Istanbul, where exiled Sephardic Jews introduced the new art and were the first printers anywhere in the Islamic world. Early in the 16th century, Hebrew presses were launched in Prague, the first place of Hebrew printing north of the Alps, and new presses were opened at Salonika in Ottoman Greece. This was the first printing anywhere in the territory of Greece, in any language, and at Fez in Morocco, where Hebrew books were the first in any language printed on the continent of Africa. Meanwhile, new presses were opened in Italy, notably by Gershom Soncino, from the famous Soncino family, who wandered from town to town with his press. It's hard even to imagine moving around in carts, in wagons, with a printing press and boxes of type, which are very heavy, until he ultimately left or fled Europe in uncertain circumstances for Salonika and Istanbul. Around this same time, a Flemish Christian by the name of Daniel Bomberg arrived in Venice and devoted his fortune over the course of the next 30 years to the printing of Hebrew books. Bomberg issued the first rabbinic Bibles, that's the Tanakh with all of the rabbinic commentaries surrounding it, and the first complete edition of the Talmud. His name became famous in the Jewish world, so much so that generations later he was referred to among Jews as Bomberg HaKodesh, Jews thinking that he was, from this name, that he was also Jewish. Venice and Istanbul long remained world centers of Hebrew book production, and in fact, for a century, Hebrew printing at Istanbul was by far, without any competition really, the most extensive of any language printing carried out anywhere in the world outside of Europe. It was not until the 1530s, long after Jews had printed in Turkey, Greece, and Morocco, that the first Hebrew books were produced in Poland. Over the course of the 16th century, Hebrew presses opened in various towns in the German lands, from Silesia and Bavaria to Bohemia, Moravia, and Switzerland. Later in the century, wandering Ashkenazic printers opened a press at Tzfas, Safed, in the Galilee, the first printing press in any language in Palestine. Strashun managed to acquire examples of books printed in the 15th century, but his 16th century books were particularly impressive, especially for a collector in Russia, far removed from the antiquarian dealers of his day in Western Europe. His catalog lists nearly 150 books from Venice in the 15th century, a remarkable number for someone collecting then, 35 from Istanbul, even more remarkable given that source, a good selection from Mantua, Cremona, and Salonika, and representative examples from various other Italian towns. There were a small number from the German lands, yet the library had 3 excessively rare books from the Swabian town of Tingen, which one almost never hears because the books are so rare. I remember Professor Abramsky saying, excessively rare, excessively rare. Strashun obviously gave attention to the Italian and Ottoman presses, and he even managed to acquire one book printed in 1579 at the short-lived press in Tzfas, Safed, in the Galilee. The major portion of the library was, of course, in Hebrew, or Hebrew and Aramaic. But there were a number of books in Yiddish and other languages, including great rarities. To mention just a few from the 16th century, he held a copy of Merkeves HaMishnah, the first book considered to be the first Yiddish book printed in Poland in the 1530s. He also had a book from Prague from 1590, of which I think only one copy exists in the world today in the Bodleian Library. And it contains the first, by virtue of its preface, introductory material, it contains the first writing by a Jewish publisher in his native vernacular, in Yiddish. Strashun also possessed a copy of the first Jewish polyglot, that is, the Pentateuch printed by heirs of the Sanchinos in Constantinople in 1546, in Hebrew, Aramaic, Judeo-Arabic, and Judeo-Persian, all four languages on the page, all in Hebrew characters. This was the first Arabic text ever printed within the Islamic world. I'll repeat that sentence. This was the first Arabic text ever printed anywhere in the Islamic world by anyone. And it was the very first text ever printed in Persian. I will repeat, it was the first text ever printed in Persian by anyone, anywhere in the world. The Strashun had 5 incunabula, that is, books printed before 1500. These 5 oldest books were all medieval texts. These were this is going to be very difficult for me. Do you want to there's only one to change, so it'll only take a moment. I'm stuck in the 15th century. You know. Thank you. The whole page, right? Yeah. These were all medieval texts. The Aruch, the Talmudic lexicon, Ibn Gavirol's ethical treatise Mivchar HaPninim, Yedaya Bedersi's ethical philosophical tract Bechines Oilom, the poetical notebooks or machbarot of Emmanuel of Rome, and finally the medical compendium known as the canon of the Persian Dr. Avicenna. The most significant in printing history is the first of these, the Aruch, printed in Rome. Lunsky was unaware of its real date. He thought it was printed in 1477. He knew it was the oldest of their 5 incunabula, but he didn't know when it was printed, or he thought it was printed in 1477. In fact, the book is one of the first 6 Hebrew books ever printed. For a long time, it was believed to be the second Hebrew book ever printed. Now, on the basis of very detailed and painstaking analysis of paper and types at the British Library, it's been determined that it's the 5th of the 6 books printed in or near Rome between 1469 and 1472. That is the first 6 books, or this one, the 5th book ever set in Hebrew type. Notably, 2 of these works in his collection, 2 of these works from those 6 books were lexical works. In fact, according to the research at the British Library, the first Hebrew book was not a Torah or a Talmud or a rabbinic work or even a commentary. It was a dictionary, Radak's Kimchi's Sefer Shorashim, the Book of Roots. I like the idea of the first Hebrew book being a lexicon. Ibn Gavirol's Mivchar HaPninim also has a certain priority to it, as it was one of the first books issued by the celebrated Sanchino family in their native town in 1484. Like the Aruch and so many of the other early books in the Strashun collection, this Mivchar HaPninim was a first edition, reprinted many times over the course of the centuries. In fact, Isaac Bashevis Singer's father, Reb Menachem Mendel Zinger, a rabbi in Warsaw who was known for rabbinical tracts in Hebrew, also translated this work into Yiddish. Both the Mivchar HaPninim and the Bechines Oilom were printed by the first generation of the Sanchinos, in Sanchino itself. Then the younger generation of the Sanchinos, Gershom Sanchino, the most famous member of the family, printed the Machberot of Emmanuel of Rome, which by virtue of its images of the zodiac is considered the first illustrated Hebrew book of all time. This is the first illustrated Hebrew book, and the first example of this popular illustrative motif in Jewish iconography over the course of the centuries. He then went on to print in various towns in northern Italy. He printed the first book in Judeo-Italian, and it's even suggested that he was involved in the cutting of the first Arabic type in Italy early in the 16th century. Lastly, the Canon of Avicenna, completed at Naples in 1492, was the only Hebrew edition of this Arabic medical treatise. It's also the only book of non-Jewish authorship printed by Jews in Hebrew in the incunable period, and that notably by a Muslim. It's also the first printed Hebrew scientific text. Interestingly, the book is an entirely Ashkenazic production. The printer and the proofreaders were identified Ashkenazi Jews, and it's highly likely that they spoke among themselves in Lashon Ashkenaz, which, by the way, was referred to elsewhere in one of the earliest Hebrew books, in a colophon from the printer, so we know that this was in the air. If Strashun's incunables were undistinguished in their rarity, in fact, they're among the most common of Hebrew incunables, which perhaps accounts for his ability to acquire them. They're nevertheless striking for another reason. They all fall at the more secular end of Hebrew literature, namely lexicography, ethics, philosophy, and medicine, none as a biblical or Talmudic text or commentary or a work of Jewish law, works which predominate in the earliest period of printing. Strashun's incunabula are a reflection of the wide-ranging interests of the collector, which encompassed both classic rabbinic texts and the Haskalah literature of his own day. This sensibility later became the most striking and memorable feature of the Strashun Library, of its famous keeper, Heike Lunsky, and of its readers over the course of the 50 years of its existence in Vilna, from the time of its establishment up to its dissolution. The fate of the Strashun incunabula, after they were seized by the Rosenberg-Stab, the staff of Nazi book experts in Vilna in 1941, is unknown. There is, however, one further reference to these oldest books in the Strashun Library. The greatest Lithuanian incunabulist of the 20th century, someone who is an expert in 15th century books. I'm not speaking about Hebrew books, I'm speaking about Latin books principally, was a Jewish librarian by the name of Feigelmanas, with whom I believe Professor Fishman collaborated on a bibliography of Yiddish serials. In Feigelman's detailed record of the now lost incunabula in Lithuanian libraries, because many were lost over time, and he has a section of his absolutely beautiful catalog of 15th century books in Lithuanian libraries. There's a section devoted to lost incunabula. In this section, he records the 5 copies which had once been held in the Strashun Library. Ironically, this is the most professional description of Strashun's incunabula, yet it was published in 1975, long after their plunder by the Nazis, when they could no longer be traced. And it was prepared on the basis of pre-war references to these books. I'll end by saying that there's an ancient Talmudic expression, Vei al da'avdin, woe for that which is lost and cannot be found. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brad. I want to welcome our first panel to the stage. Jeffrey Weidlinger, Zachary Baker, and David Fishman. Please do come up. And after the panel, there will be a short Q&A.
Hello. Wow, I didn't expect a reply. Okay, I'm just getting myself oriented. I'm going to talk today about lending libraries in general, a little bit about the Strashun collection, but about the importance of lending libraries in the late Imperial Russian Empire around the time that the Strashun Library was organized. So let me begin by stating that it's my contention that lending libraries played a crucial role in democratizing culture, in opening up whole new worlds to their readers and their patrons, and even played a critical role in ushering in the modern era to the late 19th century, to small towns in the late 19th century Russian Empire. Jewish memoirs from the Pale of Jewish settlement are rife with descriptions of libraries and the transformative role that they played in shtetl society. According to one memoirist, quotes, "It did not take long for several of us small-town youth to begin to see for ourselves a new world with entirely new horizons once they entered the library." Another memoirist wrote, quote, "The small-town folk became familiar with the larger world through the library. It opened their eyes, and they realized that there's a whole world with problems outside of Luninets and even beyond Pinsk." In towns still awaiting the arrival of electricity, movie houses, and radio, the library provided one of the few windows to the outside world. But the library provided a glimpse into the world of the modern, as seen through the perspective of Dickens' London, Hugo's Paris, Schnitzler's Vienna, and Dostoevsky's Petersburg. Like most Europeans, shtetl Jews experienced the modern age vicariously through books, but passionately nevertheless. The first Jewish libraries maintained by public funds were storehouses of religious texts collected in the best medrash of the synagogues and yeshivas that could be found in every Jewish settlement. The Galician maskil Joseph Pearl wrote of these libraries, the Beit Midrash, the Bes Medrash, quote, "There is no Jewish community in Galicia that doesn't have one or more study halls, prayer halls, and synagogues, in which can be found collections of important books organized in open cabinets, and to which everybody in the community, including the youth, has free and complete access. There are books there that have not even been checked by the censors," he wrote. And in fact, there have been many scholars who have said these were among the first public libraries anywhere in the world, were the libraries that were in synagogues that were free to anybody to come and take books to use. In the last quarter of the 19th century, though, and the turn of the 20th, free-thinking young Talmud students began smuggling into these synagogue libraries and yeshivas the new literature of the Haskalah, of the Jewish Enlightenment. The disenchanted yeshiva student who immerses himself in secular literature instead of Talmudic study in which he is supposed to be engaged is one of the most common motifs of maskilic literature and memoirs. It seems that behind every Talmud folio was a paperback mass fiction book that everybody was reading, just like the way my students hide their iPhones behind their computer screens as they're learning. Around the country, students formed small reading groups and lending libraries in private residences where they freed themselves of the exclusive study of canonical Jewish literature and exposed themselves instead to the writings of the Russian intelligentsia or the Jewish maskilim. Most of these clubs remain small in scale, perhaps just a table and a bookshelf set up in a student's room. The more daring freethinkers ventured into the large municipal Russian libraries that were just being established around the 1890s, where they immersed themselves in the literary climate of the Russian intelligentsia. Jews often constituted a majority of the members of libraries funded by public organizations, and a majority of readers in municipal libraries. For instance, in 1905, 87% of the readers of the Pushkin Municipal Library in Bobrusk were Jewish, even though the total Jewish population of the city was only around 20%. The Library of Gomel had 1,588 readers in 1903, only 27 of whom were not Jewish. Other readers obtained their books from the libraries of private individuals who opened up their doors to the public, or at least to select portions of the public. Each of these libraries had its own forte, depending upon the interests and caprices of its owner. For instance, the St. Petersburg Library of Baron David Ginsburg, one of the richest Jewish private libraries in the world, was known particularly for its collection of medieval Arabic works as well as contemporary French, German, and Italian literature. The most famous private Jewish library in the empire was probably that of Matisyahu Strashun, whose library we just heard about. During his lifetime, his home was a gathering place for the learned members of the community and a site of pilgrimage for visitors from abroad. When Matisyahu died childless, he left his library of over 5,700 volumes to the community. The library was officially opened in 1892 in Strashun's former home, but was not initially open to the general public. Realizing the current space would not suffice, in 1899, at a meeting of the Central Charity of Vilna, it was decided to build a structure to house a communal library, which would include all the books from the Strashun collection, as well as other books that are henceforth acquired. The library was to be open to the general public every day, including the Sabbath and holidays, but not on the high holidays, and was to be funded by the Central Charity. The new library was completed in 1901. At its official dedication on April 14, 1902, a choir sang Psalm 30, the hymn in honor of the dedication of Solomon's temple, and the hymn Matovu, traditionally recited upon entering the synagogue. Repeated references, both explicit and implicit, to the temple could hardly have been lost on the gathered crowd. If small-scale libraries were imagined as the surrogate Bes Medrash and synagogues, then the great Strashun Library of Vilna could only be likened to God's own temple. The success of the library was facilitated by its exceptional director, Heiko Lunsky, who served in that capacity from 1895 until the library's 1941 destruction by the Nazis. Lunsky was an Orthodox Lithuanian Jew who'd studied at both the Slonim and Mir yeshivas and was at ease in both Orthodox and secular circles within the Vilna Jewish community. In addition to serving as the Strashun librarian, he was also a collector of folklore, collecting primarily stories about the famous rabbis of Vilna and the Jewish neighborhoods of the city. Lunsky's writings on the library convey the dual role the library served, straddling, like Lunsky himself, the traditional sacred realm of Torah and the modern world of scientific knowledge. The sentiments that Lunsky expressed when talking about the library were echoed in a 1909 recollection of the library that said, quote, "It was a spiritual center for all wise men of our generation, all the young men who thirst for the glorious past and all those who seek the word of God and the wisdom of Israel through the ages. The spirit of the Jewish people fluttered among the walls of the general building, and those who came inside felt that they were entering a genuine Jewish atmosphere." The Strashun Library was, of course, the most significant, but there were many other libraries, many other similar private libraries throughout the Pale of Settlement. And these libraries, I argue, also transformed the act of reading itself. As more and more libraries proliferated, rather than meditate upon books, poring over them and memorizing word for word, the modern reader claimed to devour books, to gulp them down, to read them book after book without fully absorbing their content. Despite the efforts of library activists to publicize suggested reading lists and to circulate catalogs of books, readers in public libraries, particularly the public libraries that began to be actively promoted in the first decade of the 20th century, were more likely to meander, following their personal inclinations and interests, glancing through one book while studying another in greater detail. They read out of order and took from each book their own interpretation. Some librarians in smaller workers' libraries tried to guide their patrons, even testing them on every book they returned before allowing them to receive the next. But in larger public libraries, the exercise of this type of authority conflicted with the ideology of self-enlightenment and was impractical with the available resources. So what then were they reading? And to answer this question, I've gone through the statistics of book circulation in a little over 100 libraries in the Pale of Jewish Settlement, as well as the print run of various books to see what people were actually reading, what Jews were actually reading in these libraries. And mostly, they were reading the runaway bestsellers of the era. They were reading the potboiler books like those of Anastasia Verbitskaya's Keys to Happiness, which were titillating tales of sexual escapades. Jewish readers, like their non-Jewish contemporaries, gravitated towards French and German sensationalist novels like those of Guy de Maupassant and Arthur Schnitzler. Maupassant's portraits of torrid Parisian love affairs in the urban metropolis had appeal well beyond the French capital. Similarly, Schnitzler read well in the shtetl. Portraying the decadence and sensuality of the European bourgeoisie, Schnitzler came to represent European culture, for better or for worse, to many contemporary readers. Library activists periodically decried the popularity of these sensationalist novels among Jewish readers. The Handbook for Jewish Librarians that was issued in 1905 warned librarians to avoid writings by people of base instincts, to avoid the boulevard press and crime novels, despite the intense demand for these books on the part of the readers. On a higher level, the Russian Jewish reading public could not read enough of the works of Leo Tolstoy, whose iconic status was unmatched among contemporary writers. One indication of Tolstoy's popularity among Jewish readers was the coverage given in the Yiddish press to his death, and it was unprecedented. The Yiddish language newspapers issued a special edition, a one-page special edition, all about Tolstoy's death, and for weeks after, every day in the paper, they published major reflections on the death of Tolstoy. It was for weeks they talked about the death of Tolstoy. Other works of highbrow Russian literature were also read by predominantly Jewish students who went to these librarians. Jewish students read Turgenev, Pushkin, Lermontov, Goncharov, and Gogol, rather than the modern sensationalist novels that others were reading. When they borrowed Yiddish language materials from the libraries, they turned first and foremost to Sholem Aleichem. Print runs give us a clue to Sholem Aleichem's popularity in the first decade of the 20th century. In 1 year, in 1909, the total published print run of all of his Yiddish books together was 67,000. That's a very impressive publication figure for anybody. During the same period, the next largest print run belonged to Shomer, whose total print run was only 28,000, less than half that of Sholem Aleichem. With the exception of Sholem Aleichem, however, the circulation of belletristic works originally written in Yiddish was significantly less than that of Russian fiction. Jews still prefer, at least those who use the library, still prefer to read in Russian, belletristic literature, than in Yiddish. But Yiddish was persistently used for light reading and devotional reading. Few texts matched the popularity of the Tzena Urena, which told the biblical narrative in storybook format, ostensibly for use by women without access to the Hebrew Bible, but undoubtedly read by men as well. Popular storybooks of adventure and romance in Yiddish were also very popular and circulated well. Books on the wise men of Chelm, for instance, were very popular. These books, in addition to being read at libraries, were purchased by booksellers and in the growing number of kiosks that appeared on the streets in shtetls, and were also read in tea houses and coffee houses, in addition to being borrowed from the library. The total number of Hebrew language circulation books in libraries was only marginally less than those of Yiddish circulation. Hebrew belletristic books paled in comparison to Yiddish, but readers did turn to Hebrew books for politics, rabbinics, and polemics, but they preferred their fiction in Yiddish or Russian. Hebrew books could also still be accessed in the synagogue, so they didn't necessarily need to go to public libraries to read the Hebrew books. The Jewish common reader, though, also accessed European literature through Yiddish translation. Among the first writers to bring world literature to Yiddish audiences was Avner Tannenbaum, who was best known for the historical novels he wrote in the 1870s, books like a historical novel of the Russo-Turkish War, many of which he plagiarized from European writers and then just readopted into his own Yiddish language books and published as an original production. Other translators tried their hands at Sherlock Holmes, for instance, also taking Arthur Conan Doyle's character, and just readapting the stories to make them more accessible to shtetl readers. Other series of books translated European literature into Yiddish, books by Rudyard Kipling, Lord Byron, Charles Dickens, Thomas Mann were all translated into Yiddish. There was one series that was very popular, published by Binyamin Shimon, the World Library series, the goal of which was ostensibly to bring the classics of European literature to Jewish readers by translating the greats of European literature into Yiddish. They translated Schnitzler, Nordau, Heine, Yehuda Steinberg, Heinrich Gratz, and a bunch of other Jewish writers, as though all European literature was Jewish literature, translating it into Yiddish. Also, the newspapers like Der Freien, the Yiddish newspapers, published the works of Victor Hugo, Charles Dickens, and Hans Christian Andersen. Popular science was also very popular in libraries, and audiences really enjoyed reading Yiddish popular science. Books with titles like Thunder and Lightning, about weather patterns, and Rocks That Fall from Heavens, or How Animals Live, were also very popular in Yiddish. These were mostly translated from the Russian, from also Russian popular science books. And these books helped formulate the worldview of countless young people, Jews and non-Jews alike, who used them as guides to help them understand and appreciate the natural world around them and the wonders of modern science. Also popular were books with titles like The Greatest Criminal Trials, which had a print run of 9,000 issues per volume. Travel books about adventures, travel adventures through Europe, Turkey, China, and Japan were also very popular. And the Warsaw-based home library publishers flooded the market with sensationalist Yiddish language series that were very popular, with titles like Jewish Pogrom Trials, The Most Terrible Moments in Jewish History, one of my favorite. It's just an endless book, The Most Terrible Moments in Jewish History. Jewish False Messiahs is another one, and these types of books really were very popular. And then a whole nother genre of books was self-help books, which were very popular at the beginning of the 20th century. Books with titles like How to Preserve One's Health, How to Educate Yourself, How to Tell the Character of a Person by Their Outward Appearance, How I Won the Lottery, as if there's a technique. How I Acquired $500 million, as told by the millionaire Rockefeller himself. Kind of like a precursor to The Art of the Deal. And a book with a promising title of The Road to Happiness had a print run of 9,000 copies. Many readers believed that the keys to financial, educational, emotional, and personal success could be found in 32-page Yiddish pamphlets. At the same time, libraries were communal spaces providing a home away from home for readers in search of community. And I just want to end on one very quick story, which is about one town that had two libraries in the town. One was a Bundist library and one was a Zionist library. And both of them were very popular, but they had about, 60, 70% of the books in both libraries were the same, because there was a fundamental set of books that they had, and then they had their own Zionist books or socialist books. And so the two libraries decided they would combine, that they would make one communal space. And they did, and they could save a lot of money that way and a lot of resources, but nobody came to the library. And suddenly no one was coming, and they asked, why is nobody coming? And people said, well, in the Bundist library, it really felt like we had our own space. This was, my own place where I could come and I could meet friends and have coffee and read books. And now that it's just a big public space, it feels so foreign to us. So it kind of gets to the point that really what mattered and the reason people were going to libraries was for the sense of community, not just to read. So I'll end on that. Thank you.
Could I have? Okay. So it'll take a second. All right. There we go. Oops. Yeah. Usually F5 works, but this one, yeah. Well, let me get the slides up first, for crying out loud. There we go, thank you.
Yeah, you just click through.
Right. The Strashun Library was part of a loose network of public libraries, in quotes, serving the Jews of Vilna. The collections and services of these offered by these libraries complemented one another, though more by happenstance than by design. We're not talking about a network of Carnegie-style libraries. Rather, each of the Vilna libraries operated under the auspices of particular community agencies and usually from hand to mouth. Today I'll discuss the Strashun Library and two other libraries that functioned as public-style libraries serving the Jewish community of Vilna. Specifically, these other libraries were the Library of the Chevra Mefitzei HaSkola, also known by its Russian initials OPE, and the Children's Library of the Zentraler Bildungskommitee, the Central Educational Committee. All three libraries served distinctive but often overlapping constituencies within the diverse and rapidly evolving cultural matrix that characterized Jewish Vilna during the interwar decades. The librarian Heikel Lunsky once wrote that several booksellers had lending libraries in Vilna, offering books to customers for a fee and for a limited loan period. Some political movements, as we've just heard, and professional organizations also maintained libraries for their members. However, in his 1916-1917 survey of Jewish libraries in Vilna, Moshe Shalit excluded these libraries from treatment, from extended treatment. Only the three libraries operating under Jewish community sponsorship that were open to the general public. Strashun's Bibliothek, as it was referred to in Yiddish, occupied pride of place among these libraries. The first of the three to be established, it was renowned, as we have heard, for its extensive collections of old and rare Hebraica. It functioned under the aegis of Vilna's official Kehillah, and as such was accessible to all, although until the First World War, women were not permitted to sit in the library's main reading room. Its core collection, though by far from comprising the majority of its books, were the 6,000 or so volumes left to the Vilna Jewish Kehillah by Matisyahu Strashun. In addition to this cornerstone legacy, it also included other libraries rich in rabbinica, such as those belonging to Shmuel Yosef Fin and Yehuda Behak, and in Haskalah literature, for example, the Library of Chaim Leib Markon. The Strashun Library also owns several thousand Judaica books in European languages and in Yiddish. The Strashun Library first opened its doors in 1892 and relocated to its own building adjoining the great synagogue in the Vilna Schulhof, and this is a diagram of the Vilna Schulhof that you see, and that was in 1902. It was thus situated both literally and symbolically at the center of the Vilna community. As of 1916, there were approximately 19,000 volumes in Strashun's Bibliothek, and by the mid-1930s, the collections had grown to 35,000 volumes, including, as Brad Sabin-Hill has just told us, 5 incunabula, 400 16th century imprints, of which 55 dated from before the Hebrew year 5300 or 1540, and about 150 old manuscripts. In the mid-1930s, the Strashun Library's holdings were broken down as follows: 50% rabbinica, 25% Haskalah literature in Hebrew, 15% Yiddish, and 10% Judaica in languages other than Hebrew or Yiddish. Thus, the Strashun Library was visited by an average of 230 readers each day, of whom 75% were males. Meanwhile, its long tables had enough room to seat only about 100 readers at a time at 2 readers per bench. In other words, there was a waiting list of people wanting to sit and read there. Initially, the library was open 7 days a week, except for the high holidays. Later on, it closed on Shabbos and other holidays. Books could be read only on premises. This was not a circulating library. Who were its readers? You see the diagram up there, and I won't necessarily read line by line, but as you can see, there was a striking shift in readership patterns by the 1930s from rabbis and scholars to students. This shift was accompanied by a change in patterns of usage. According to Lunsky, by the 1930s, 45% of books requested were in Hebrew, 45% in Yiddish, and 10% in other languages. And according to genres, belles lettres, 25%, scholarship in various disciplines and history, etc., meaning everything else, 75%. Two jarringly contrasting journalistic accounts of the Strashun Library were published in the year 1926. each of which sheds light on public perceptions of its situation and prospects. B. Scharfer's piece, I think that's Falk Halperin, in Kunst und Leben, bore the sardonic title Auf den alten balabatischen Steiger, in the old bourgeois manner. He wrote about the disarray and neglect to which Vilna's Jewish libraries were consigned, singling out the Strashun Library in a litany of complaints. All the mold and dust of the Schulhof, where this library is located, incidentally, he wrote, has found a comfortable place there. In his view, the library's holdings sorely needed modernizing, and their contents needed to be accessible to scholarly and orderly, i.e., Yiddish readers alike. Runs of journals and newspapers were missing many issues. There were large gaps in the library's Judaica holdings. Tables of contents and indexes were entirely lacking, and the library's catalog was hopelessly antiquated. The Strashun Library's governance structure was moribund. Its leadership was stagnant, vergliedert was the word he used, paralyzed by inaction, and its roster of directors stacked with, there they are, unqualified time servers. The community has to take control, Scharfer concluded. New people need to be brought in who will bring with them the winds of change. The Strashun Library requires a radical cure, in the absence of which this treasure house will turn into a mound of Seamus, discards. Meanwhile, A. Judels, I think that's Avram Golomb in the Literarische Blätter, took a far more benign view of the state of affairs in the Strashun Library. There are larger and richer libraries, he wrote, but in none of them does one have the same sort of experience as when one enters Strashun's Bibliothek, as we Vilna Jews refer to it. The Schulhof, in his view, instead of being a repository of mold and dust, was depicted as atmospheric and picturesque. Amidst all of the passageways, Durchhäufen, where the ancient trade in old clothes, bits of herring, frozen apples, tzitzis, and sidurim flourishes, is situated this authentically Jewish library, one that he said represented the synthesis of the old and new Yiddishkeit, of the natural transition from the piety, the Frumkeit, of yesteryear to the secularism, Weltlichkeit of the present. And who comprised the library's clientele? Students from Jewish secondary schools and seminaries, workers in their weekday garb. A rabbi sits in the corner, and you can often spot a Yiddish writer or teacher. There is something for everyone in Strashun's Bibliothek. As a former yeshiva student, Judels, also underscored the Strashun Library's pivotal role in fostering the spirit of enlightenment among his contemporaries, setting them, in his words, on the path of modern education. Previously, women came here rarely. Rabbis, scholars, and yeshiva boys sat over large Talmud volumes and responsa. Now I encounter a very different crowd. Girls, litvachkas, with bobbed hair, have invaded, and yeshiva boys are seldom to be seen, not for love or money. Nowadays, our rabbis can scarcely spare the time to drop by Strashuns. A different crowd is seen here, mainly students from the Yiddish and Hebrew schools. They come here every day by the hundreds. Today's typical reader requests different books, Judels concluded. Nowhere else, he said, do you feel the natural transition from tradition to modern Yiddishkeit, and nowhere else do you sense the firm connection between Yiddishkeit and living Jews than in the old Strashun's Bibliothek of Vilna. As evidence of this transition, in 1928, the Strashun Library became a de facto depository of Hebrew and Yiddish books published in Poland, and these were funneled to it by the University Library in Vilna. Though I've referred to its collections as non-circulating, this needs to be amended somewhat. In 1904, it opened a lending library that drew upon duplicates from the main library's holdings and from the libraries of two Zionist organizations, Benos Zion and HaTechia. The lending library was closed, Lunsky later explained, because, in his words, because it was a distraction to the readers of the Strashun Library, the ones who couldn't take the other books out. So when the Vilna branch of the Chevra Mefitze Haskalah opened its library in 1910, it purchased the approximately 4,000 Hebrew and Yiddish books from the shuttered Strashun Lending Library. The Mefitze Haskalah's parent organization, OPA, was founded in St. Petersburg in 1863, originally with an agenda encouraging the Russification through secular education of the empire's Jews. Leza Ran writes that the Mefitze Haskalah Library in Vilna was brought under the wings of the Kehillah at the end of the First World War, because given the demise of the Tsarist Empire, the OPA had lost its raison d'etre in the Eastern European successor states. As of 1916, 1917, Moshe Shalit wrote, and I'm quoting, "Now, Mefitze Haskalah is the most accessible library in the city, serving the broadest strata of the Jewish population." Along with the children's library, it was the only Jewish community library in Vilna that allowed readers to take books home. Notwithstanding its rapid growth from about 8,000 volumes in 1911 to 13,500 in 1915, it was unable to keep pace with its readers' demands. Circulation jumped from 26,024 in 1911 to 67,560 only 4 years later. The two largest categories of students were students on the one hand and artisans and sales employees, Handelsangestellte, on the other, accounting for over 70% of all users. In the library's early years, books in Russian accounted for the overwhelming majority of items circulated, with Hebrew in second place and Yiddish a distant third, a fact that Shalit found rather disturbing. An overwhelming majority of the titles circulated during these early years in all languages were belles lettres, reflecting both readers' preferences and the library's holdings. A sizable majority of readers in this 1916-17 account were between 12 and 20 years of age, and the gender ratio was 60% male, 40% female. By 1932, the Mefitze Haskalah Library's collections had grown to 40,000 volumes, 19,000 in Russian, 10,000 in Yiddish, 7,000 in Polish. Polish books were not permitted there before the Polish Republic was established. 6,000 in Hebrew, and 1,000 in French and other European languages. Each year, the library acquired about 2,000 new volumes and lost, in quotes, between 300 and 400 volumes. Presumably, these were books that were not returned. Fully 86% of its holdings were belles lettres. Annual circulation in the 30s was about 100,000 items. The library had 2,000 paid-up subscribers, and while the breakdown in age was close to the figures provided years earlier by Shalit, the gender balance had shifted. 53% of its readers were female and 47% male. Appropriately enough, the Mefitze Haskalah Library had its headquarters on Ulica Strashuna, Strashun Street, number 6. In addition to its main collection, during the 1930s, it also maintained a public reading room for newspapers and journals, plus 2,000 books. Daily admission cost 10 groszy. I don't know what that translates into in pennies, cents, dollars, but it's cheap. The reading room attracted between 12,000 and 15,000 readers annually. The final chapter of the Mefitze Haskalah Library came during the years 1941 to 1943. As we've heard, as is well known, Alfred Rosenberg's Einsatzstab confiscated the Strashun Library and shipped thousands of its books to Germany. Meanwhile, the Mefitze Haskalah Library was claimed by the ghetto's inhabitants and operated openly as the ghetto library for almost 2 years, until the final liquidation of the Vilna ghetto in the summer of 1943. In October 1942, its wartime director, Hermann Kruk, a librarian from Warsaw who sought refuge in Vilna in 1939, produced a detailed annual report entitled Library and Reading Room in the Vilna Ghetto, Strashun Street 6. In his preface, he praised the former director of the library, Fajvush Krasny, for building up the largest Jewish library in Vilna in terms of both numbers of volumes in its collections and the quantity of books circulated to readers. As of September 1939, the total number of volumes in the Matisyahu Strashun Library had grown to 45,000. And, quoting Crook, foreign language books, meaning books in languages other than Yiddish or Hebrew, comprised a solid majority, accounting for the fact that circulation of Hebrew and Yiddish books combined amounted to less than 20% of the total number of books circulated. In the chaos surrounding the occupation of Vilna in the summer of 1941, the library lost about 20% of its books through confiscation, theft, and loss. These were the best and most popular books in the library by Crook's estimation. When Crook and his colleagues took possession on September 8, 1941, the library held about 39,000 volumes. During the following year, it took in about 4,000 volumes from other pre-war library collections, and the library set up small satellite libraries in the ghetto prison and in several offices and clubs. And I hasten to point out, it was not acquiring new books from outside. This was a frozen library or group of libraries we're talking about. Crook's report makes for fascinating and also chilling reading when we try to comprehend the conditions under which the library functioned and the ultimate fate of its clientele and staff. Extensive statistical tables are accompanied in Crook's report by interpretations of readership patterns, and yet while fully acknowledging the miracle of the book, as he called it, Crook could not help but draw the conclusion that, quoting him, librarianship can be pursued in the ghetto only to the extent that anything can be achieved here. Just as conditions are difficult in every other area of ghetto life, they are all the more difficult in the library. Crook noted in passing the fate of the other circulating library that had served Vilna's Jews. Remarking upon the shortage of children's books in the ghetto, especially in Yiddish, he wrote, "Previously, children were served by the Children's Library, which had 20,000 volumes of specially selected content at its disposal. That library has been completely destroyed, and its former director was among the 20,000 Jews who were murdered during the actions of the autumn of 1941. The Children's Library had been founded in 1909, 1 year before Matisyahu Strashun. As of 1916, it had just under 5,000 volumes, very few of them in Yiddish. The vast majority of books borrowed were in Russian, the language of instruction in public schools until then. The extreme poverty of Yiddish children's literature is almost completely responsible for that, Moshe Shalit wrote during World War I. That would soon change. A few years later, in 1921, an article about the Children's Library appeared in Die Neue Schule, the organ of the Yiddish Central School Organization in Vilna. The article's author, Ches Weisbord, discussed the pedagogical challenges connected with book selection for children, described the educational programs that the library offered to them, and pointed out the budgetary issues confronting the library. At that juncture, it was running a considerable deficit. The author lamented the fact that, in her words, I think it's a she, the Jewish child relates very poorly to the book in general, treats it with too little attention and love. Frequently, a book will be returned with handwriting on it. Oftentimes, it will be returned dirty, even torn. I'm sure that practice never happened in any other children's library. Two other Jewish libraries in Vilna bear mentioning, but only in passing: the Shin Ansky Jewish Historical and Ethnographic Society and the YIVO Institute. The first of these, with its museum, extensive archive, and 6,000-volume library, came under the authority of the Vilna Kehila in 1935, and thus, in a sense, became administratively aligned with the Mefitze Haskalah and children's libraries. As for YIVO, it was an independent research institution, one with library and press holdings on a par with the public libraries, in my phrase, that have been the subject of this presentation. Finally, a brief postscript. My first professional position as a librarian 4 decades ago was as a cataloger of Yiddish books in the YIVO library. The Institute had been awarded a sizable grant by a federal agency known as the National Endowment for the Humanities to catalog the several thousand 19th and 20th century Yiddish books in its Vilna collection. Most had previously belonged to the Strashun Library. These were not the rare editions of Torah commentaries or responsa literature or grammars or lexica for which the Strashun Library was justly famous. Rather, they included the works of such classic Yiddish and European authors as Mendele Moicher Sforim, Yud Lamed Peretz, Shalom Aleichem, Thomas Mann, Romain Rolland, Knut Hamsun, as well as chapbooks by the likes of Isaac Mayer Dick, Yehoshua Mezach, and Koppel Dua. The presence of books such as these in Vilna's great treasure house testifies to the importance of Strashun's bibliothek not only to the city's great scholars and sages, but also to Yidden von a ganz Jahr, those ordinary, everyday Jewish readers who made Vilna such a special place. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I have a correction on the title of my talk, actually. It's the Strashun Library in Wartime, 1941 to 1947. And what I'm going to present to you is culled from my forthcoming book, The Book Smugglers, which will be out in the fall. It's one of the ironies of history that while Nazi Germany undertook the total extermination of the Jews, the Germans had an intense and one might say perverse interest in collecting and preserving Jewish books and documents. They looted Jewish libraries and archives all across Europe for the sake of the scientific field of Judenforschung, anti-Semitic Jewish studies, which would analyze the depravity of this subhuman race. Jewish libraries were plundered by the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, which I'm going to call from now on by its abbreviation, the ERR, which was Nazi Germany's main looting agency for cultural treasures. And the main beneficiary of the plunder of Jewish books was the Institut zur Erforschung der Judenfrage, the Institute for the Investigation of the Jewish Question in Frankfurt. Vilna, and the Strashun Library in particular, was one of the ERR's prime targets. The German assault on the library began in early July 1941, just 10 days after the German conquest of Vilna, with the arrival in the city of Dr. Johannes Paul, the top Judaica expert for the ERR, and the librarian of the Frankfurt Institute for the Investigation of the Jewish Question. Paul was an ordained Catholic priest who spent 2 years studying in Jerusalem, and then after Hitler's rise to power, he abandoned the clergy to pursue a career as a Judaica librarian and as a Nazi propagandist. Paul came to Vilna prepared. Upon his arrival, he ordered the house arrest of the heads of Vilna's 3 greatest Jewish repositories, the arrest of Noach Prilutsky, who was then the director of YIVO, of Remeliel Goldschmidt, who was the curator of the Shin Ansky Museum, and Heiko Lunsky, the librarian of the Strashun Library. The 3 were forced at gunpoint to hand over their institution's greatest treasures to Paul and the ERR. This was a coordinated German assault on the written Jewish word. The fact that the operation took place just a few days after the German attack on the Soviet Union indicated that the seizure of Vilna's Judaica was a high priority. Sometime in early August, the Germans put the three scholars, Prilutsky, Lunsky, and Goldschmidt, into a single cell in the Gestapo prison, from which they continued to be taken daily to their respective workplaces. It is in this period that the Strashun Library's most valuable rarities, that is the 5 incunabula, disappeared, never to be found again. Lunsky was the only one of those 3 scholars who survived imprisonment. Prilutsky was executed on August 18th. Goldschmidt died apparently from beatings in prison. Lunsky was released in early September, just in time to be herded along with Vilna's 40,000 remaining Jews into the Vilna ghetto. Johannes Paul left Vilna with a stash of looted treasures. He had other cities to go to, other treasures to loot in other places. But the ERR would return to Vilna 6 months later, in February 1942. After the Jews' confinement in the ghetto, the central personality, I'll come back to this map in a minute, the central personality responsible for preserving Vilna's Jewish book treasures was Hermann Kruk, a refugee librarian and bibliographer from Warsaw, who had headed Warsaw's greatest Jewish lending library, the Grosser Library. Kruk was a Bundist and a gentleman. Even in the ghetto, he filed his fingernails and polished his shoes. 3 days after the formation of the Vilna ghetto, the Judenrat appointed him director of the ghetto library. The existence of the ghetto library, as Zachary mentioned, was largely a result of happenstance. The lending library of the Hebrew Mifitze Haskola found itself, by coincidence, in the territory that the Germans demarked as ghetto number 1 at 6 Strashun Street. That's number 1 on the map. While located on Strashun Street, this was hardly the Strashun Library by any stretch of the imagination. It held mainly fiction, educational literature, much of it in Russian. There were no rarities, there were no treasures. It was a public service lending library with a collection of 45,000 volumes. The library became the Vilna Ghetto's central cultural institution with a staff of 14 employees, including YIVO's deputy director Zela Kalmanovich and Chaiko Lunsky of the Strashun Library. And it lent out more than 150,000 books in the course of its 2-year existence. But for our topic, what matters is Kruk didn't see himself as just the custodian over the collection in the former Mifitze Haskola library. He used that institution as his base to gather and rescue Jewish cultural treasures in Vilna, both inside the ghetto and beyond the ghetto. And foremost on his mind was the Strashun Library, how to rescue it, how to get it. The Strashun Library found itself within the boundaries of the smaller ghetto number 2, which existed for only 2 months. It was liquidated on October 24th, 1941, when almost all of its 11,000 inhabitants were sent to be executed at Ponar, the mass murder site outside of Vilna. Kruk and his library were in ghetto number 1. And after the liquidation of the smaller ghetto, Kruk had no information whatsoever about the state of the Strashun collection. In December 1941, Kruk got authorization from the Judenrat, from the Jewish Council, to make a special expedition outside the ghetto to the Strashun Library to retrieve volumes from there. And he made, in that day, several trips back and forth with a hand wagon. He visited the Strashun Library a second time at his own initiative in January 1942, when he was granted an extraordinary 2-day travel pass outside the ghetto, to leave the ghetto. Instead of doing business in town, as others did, stocking up on food, fur, leather, or gold, he spent his time selecting books from the Strashun Library. As a result of these 2 excursions, Kruk rescued 2,464 books from the Strashun Library, most of which were rarities that he kept in a hiding place inside the bowels of the ghetto library. They were not available and not even known to the reading public of the ghetto library. In February 1942, the ERR returned in full force to Vilna to resume its looting activity. But the ERR had learned a lesson from its initial foray back in July. There were just too many cultural treasures in Vilna for a quick and easy raid or plunder. The Germans needed a brigade of Jewish slave laborers to sort the books and select the most valuable items for shipment to Germany. On February 11th, ERR officers went to the ghetto library. That is, they entered the ghetto and walked into Kruk's office and informed him that he now worked for them. He would collect and sort books, manuscripts, documents, and select the items for shipment to Germany. He could keep his other position as director of the ghetto library. And to perform this task, Kruk hired and headed a brigade of intellectuals, educators, writers, and scholars, which ghetto inmates came to nickname the Paper Brigade. It initially consisted just of 3 experts, Kruk, Kalmanovich, and Chaiko Lunsky of the Strashun Library. But it eventually grew to 20 experts, including the young Vilna poets here, Shmerka Kaczerginsky and Avrom Sutzkever. The brigade's first assignment was to transfer the remaining Strashun Library, still located in its empty building in the ghost-like ghetto number 2, to designate a space at the Vilna University Library at Uniwersytecka Street 3. If I go back up, you can't see Uniwersytecka on this map, but it continues up just beyond Dominikanska Street. In other words, it's really a 2-3 street walk out of ghetto number 2 up to the university. There, at 3 Uniwersytecka Street, the brigade unpacked the books, sorted them, prepared them for shipment to Germany. Of course, Lunsky gasped. He was being ordered to destroy the library he had built and led for 40 years. The Germans presented their plunder as a form of rescue. They were borrowing the books, which they claimed would be much safer in Germany, far away from the war front, than in Vilna. Kruk, who had always seemed to keep his composure, was unnerved by the assignment, and he wrote in his Vilna Ghetto diary, Kalmanovich and I don't know, are we gravediggers or are we saviors? If we succeed in keeping the treasures in Vilna, it could be to our great merit. But if they take the library away, we will have been accomplices. Kruk tried to keep as many books as possible in Vilna through various means. For instance, he asked the head of the ERR team for permission to transfer duplicate Strashun Library books to the ghetto library. And the ERR officer agreed. Take the duplicates, we don't need duplicates. He also began stealing books behind the Germans' backs. He slipped volumes into his pockets, he hid them elsewhere in the building of Vilna University Library until he had an opportunity to take them into the ghetto. Kruk was the first book smuggler of Strashun Library books. After a month of satisfactory work, the Germans awarded Kruk the title Supervisor of Work regarding the processing of Jewish books. It came, this title, Supervisor, with a precious fringe benefit, an ironclad permit which allowed him to exit the ghetto freely without an escort and roam around the city in search of Jewish books. It also granted him the privilege of entering the ghetto without a body search at the gate. And that made it a lot easier for him personally to smuggle books and papers inside. In March 1942, the ERR decided to open a second work site, a much larger work site for Jewish books and papers at the YIVO building at 18 Vivulskiva Street. But the Strashun collection remained at Uniwersytecka Street, and work there continued intermittently. Then in April of 1942, the ERR's headquarters in Berlin made a momentous policy decision. All Jewish books and artifacts that were not valuable enough to be sent to Germany were to be destroyed. The ERR was responsible for both tasks, what it called the collection of material and the destruction of material. This made Crook's efforts to smuggle books into the ghetto all the more urgent and pressing. He enlisted the members of the paper brigade as fellow book smugglers. And Crook was very pleased with the early responses. He wrote again in his diary, quote, "People are trying to rescue, and they're doing much. The risk to their lives for every piece of paper is awesome. Every scrap of paper endangers their head. Nonetheless, there are idealists who are doing this skillfully." The group believed that the safest hiding place for books and papers was inside the ghetto, among fellow Jews. But the Germans considered smuggling materials into the ghetto to be a severe offense on two accounts. First, they were stealing property from their workplace, and Paul, who came back from time to Vilna, and the other ERR officers made it absolutely clear there were only two destinations for books and papers: Germany or the paper mills where the books were repulped into new paper. And second reason why the Germans considered this a serious offense, there was a blanket prohibition on bringing printed matter into the ghetto by anyone from anywhere. But toward the end of the workday, these workers would wrap papers around their bodies and stuff them inside their clothing. They created girdles and diapers and filled them with books and papers. As the brigade left YIVO, or left Universitetska Street, for the ghetto, the question on everyone's mind was who would be manning the gate for inspections. If it was Jewish ghetto policemen or even Lithuanian guards, that was usually no problem. The inspection would not be particularly strict. But if Germans, such as Franz Murer, the Deputy Gebietskommissar for Jewish Affairs, or SSR squad leader Bruno Kittel were stationed at the gate, all bets were off. The Germans mercilessly beat inmates discovered carrying any form of contraband. And Murer, the Deputy Gebietskommissar, showed up frequently to do surprise inspection. And when he found a returning worker with bread or money under his or her coat, he stripped them naked, whipped them, and threw them into prison. It all depended which prison they were sent to. If he sent them to the ghetto prison, they would probably survive. If he sent them to Lukishki prison in the city, their next stop would be Ponar, the mass execution site. But poet Shmerke Kaczerginski is known to have smuggled numerous Strashun Library books past German guards. His audacity was breathtaking. Shmerke once carried a huge volume of a Talmud up to the gate in broad daylight and explained to the German guard, "My chief of the ERR has ordered me to take this book into the ghetto to have it rebound in the bindery of the ghetto library." The ghetto library had a bindery. "I'm to have it rebound and then I'll return it to work." The Gestapo man couldn't imagine that this short and cross-eyed Jew would concoct a blatant lie like that could cost him his life, so he let him through. On another occasion, Shmerke came to the ghetto gate with a Torah cover wrapped around his torso and rare Strashun Library books stuffed against his body, only to find a long line ahead of him with SS Oberscharführer Bruno Kittel personally inspecting people at the gate. Kittel was a known sadist. He shot ghetto inmates for sport. Everyone in line dumped their potatoes, their bread, their firewood onto the street. But Shmerke didn't unload. He ended up being lucky. Just before he reached the front of the line, Kittel left. Shmerke marched in the ghetto unscathed. Inside the ghetto, books and documents were kept in 10 different hiding places. The largest and most elaborate was the bunker at 6 Chaville Street, which was used by the armed ghetto partisan organization, the FPO, to store weapons. It was a cavern that descended more than 60 feet underground. You entered through a sewage system, you climbed down ladders 2 levels to a facility that had its own ventilation and electricity. Beginning in the spring of 1943, the partisans, the FBO, opened up the bunker to the paper brigade. and crates of books lay alongside crates of arms. Kruk, Lunsky, and most other members of the paper brigade did not survive the war. Lunsky reportedly chose to go into hiding at the time of the ghetto's final liquidation on September 23, 1943, but his hiding place was discovered 5 days later. The head of the Strashun Library went to Ponar, where nearly all of his readers had gone before him. But many books survived. In fact, a rather high proportion of books survived. And this was thanks to the fact that both the Germans and Kruk and the Paper Brigade appreciated the extraordinary value of this collection. And as a consequence, most of the collection ended up either in Frankfurt at the Institute, or it stayed in Vilnius, either at the university or in hiding places. So actually, this was a lucky collection. Relatively little of it was sent to destruction. The part, and I'm going to wrap up with the post-war story, the part that remained in Vilna was retrieved by the survivors, so Schmerke, Sutzkever, others, who returned to the city after its liberation by the Red Army on July 13, 1944. They founded a Jewish museum in Vilna, which housed, among other things, the Strashun Library's books, the ones hidden, the ones discovered. The museum existed for 5 years. The Soviet authorities closed it down in June 1949 in the midst of Stalin's intense anti-Semitic campaigns. The library of that dissolved museum, including the Strashun books, was officially transferred to the book chamber of the Lithuanian SSR, a state-sponsored book archive. And that institution held on to the Strashun volumes for the remaining 41 years of Soviet rule, under varying circumstances. But during that period, the books were never accessible to researchers or readers. After Lithuanian independence, the book chamber merged with the Lithuanian National Library, and that is where Strashun books are held to this day. The other part of the Strashun Library was discovered in the summer of 1945 in Frankfurt, which you can see is in the American zone of occupied Germany, in the cellars of the Institut zur Erforschung der Judenfrage. Fortunately, they were in the American zone of occupied Germany. If they'd been in Berlin, in the Soviet zone, we would probably never have heard about them, at least for the next 40-whatever years. Max Weinreich of YIVO in New York had urged the American authorities to look for YIVO's collections in the building of the Institute, and he gave them the address, 68 Bodenheimer Landstrasse. Additional Strashun books were discovered in the town of Hungen, 50 miles north of Frankfurt. The Institute had transferred much of its holdings to Hungen to avoid Allied aerial bombing. The Americans moved the Strashun and YIVO books and a million other Jewish looted books from all across Europe into a special facility known as the Offenbach Archival Depot. YIVO laid claim to both its own books and archives and to what it called associated libraries, the Ansky Museum, the Strashun Library, and other Vilna Jewish collections. The Americans deliberated and delayed for 1.5 years. According to international law, property looted in wartime was to be returned to its country of origin. The War Department supported following this rule, that is, returning the books from Vilna, including the Strashun Library books, either to Poland, after all, before the war, Vilna had been Poland, or to Soviet Lithuania. But the State Department favored recognizing the New York YIVO as the owner of its own collections and as the heir to the other Vilna Jewish collections, including the Ansky Museum and the Strashun Library. In the end, the State Department prevailed, and the books and archives arrived on these shores in July 1947. Here they've been accessible to researchers and scholars ever since. The fate of the Strashun Library under the Nazis paralleled the fate of the Vilna Jewish community. Much of the collection was destroyed. Its librarian was murdered. Its building was ruined by bombing in the 1944 Battle of Vilnius. But the fact that so many of the books survived intact and were retrieved is some comfort and consolation. The members of the paper brigade believed that if the books survived, the essence of the Jerusalem of Lithuania would live on. They risked their lives so that future generations would have these treasures. And while they perished, that dream of theirs came true. Thank you.
I'd like to ask the panelists to come up to the stage. We have some time for question and answer, and we have people, Alex with the microphone. So,
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. I was wondering about Polish language books not being allowed in the Matisyahu Strashun Library until the Polish Republic, and whose decision was that, and why was that language specifically not allowed?
The decision was Tsar Nikolai II's decision. And, there are a whole array of historical issues connected with Polish language and culture in any form in the Russian Empire outside of Congress Poland proper, which this is, and Vilna was it was disputed linguistic territory.
yes, in the back. Farther back, Alex.
Thank you. It's a two-part question. Number one, this is a little bit for Sabin. I'm wondering, compared to the Valmadonna Library that's been in the news a lot now, Jack Lunzer's library was just bought by the National Library in Israel. So I'm wondering, to compare the Strashun Library to that one, how would that compare? And for the panelists, why did the rabbis stop coming? It seems, were they not comfortable there? Did the material change in the library so they weren't? How did that come about? Because it seemed as it got closer to World War II, there were less and less rabbis at the Strashun Library.
Yes, the Strashun Library was never comparable to the great collections in Western Europe. The British Museum collection, can you hear me? The Bodleian collection, or the Rosenthaliana collection in Amsterdam. The Valmadonna Library is comparable to those three. Nevertheless, there were a certain number of books which were in common between them. As I pointed out, the Strashun Library had only 5 incunabula. All of those other libraries have in the tens or up to as many as 100 incunabula, for example, at the British Library. On the other hand, I was surprised and pleased to see that there were a number of books recorded in Likutei Shoshanim, which other copies of which were displayed at the exhibit of the Valmadonna collection at the Pierpont Morgan Library in New York. Not one, but several. Which gives an idea as to the sort of material which was collected by Strashun, if in not so many numbers, so great a quantity as in the Valmadonna Library. Nevertheless, you can see that there was a certain commonality. The very fact that Strashun was able to assemble so many books from Venice and from Istanbul sitting there in Vilna is a mark of his collecting, his enthusiasm for the exotic. In fact, in general, one can see that he was interested, every collector, frankly, not just Strashun, is interested in what's exotic to himself. That's why there's so little material from Poland in the earliest part of the Strashun collection, whereas there's this relatively large amount of material from Italy and the Ottoman Empire.
Regarding the readership question, I don't have an answer to why there would have been fewer rabbis, other than that the sources that I was found this mentioned were anecdotal or eyewitness sources. So I don't have an answer for that. But readership patterns in general were changing simply because the community was changing and secularizing and modernizing.
And I'll add, synagogue libraries remained a possibility, so people could still read in the traditional Beis Midrash.
Thank you for an excellent discussion. I just have a couple of general questions. One was an observation. Perhaps the Rebbeim weren't going to the libraries because it was now admitting women. That might have been a deterring force. Just offer that as a suggestion. Of the library in Lithuania, how many books would you say we have today or in existence today as compared to the amount of books that existed before the war? In other words, how many were lost approximately? And secondly, I wanted to ask, which is the larger collection? The one that has arrived here after the war or the one that's still in Lithuania? Thank you.
Actually, I don't have exact numbers on that. Our colleague, maybe Ludmila Sholchova, will have numbers, but my impression is, and I'm happy to be corrected, that YIVO has, something like 10,000 books from Strashun? And I imagine Lithuania, I don't know if they've really counted, because I'm talking about the Strashun Library as it existed on the eve of the war. I don't really, not about the personal library of Matisyahu Strashun, but the Strashun Jewish Community Library on the eve of the war. But I imagine in Lithuania they must have thousands. I don't know, you'd have to go by ex libris and count. So that's why I was thinking to myself, if 15,000 out of 40,000 or so books survived, that is a very high survival rate. Right? You know, that's that's 40%. And I don't think there's another library that went through this history that survived to that extent.
It's my understanding that there's still a lot of Strashun books in Russia. What are the chances of first getting those books, or at least digitizing them so that they're part of the collection?
I don't know much about, I'm sure there are stray Strashun volumes in Russia, but what we're talking about is the bulk of them are in Vilna, in Vilnius, which is Lithuania. Though there are probably stray volumes both in Moscow and Kiev, but they're not significantly numerically.
Just to add on the discussion of the whereabouts of the books, most of the books that were in the library, we have other copies of those books, right? It's just the rare books that seem to me particularly important. 90% of the library is duplicated in other places anyway. It's nice to have it all in one place and as a communal library to work at, but in reality, it's a small percentage that's
That's where I guess where I disagree. I guess that's where I disagree. First of all, I think the possibility that there are rare items is not small. And rare does not necessarily mean old. There can be rare 19th century and even rare 20th century items. So I think the possibility that there are rare items is pretty high in Vilnius. And second of all, I would simply say any book that went through this story, that was rescued from the Nazis, is precious and is in a certain sense unique. Even it may have a stamp that indicates part of that, from the ERR. And even if it doesn't, it's unique and in some ways different than the copy that's at JTS in New York or somewhere else.
So thank you all very, very much. We're going to take a 10-minute break, and please do come back for panel number 2. It's my great pleasure now to introduce Frida Shore, who will deliver the second keynote Professor Shore is the library director and lecturer at Ariel University in Israel. Dr. Shore.
Von der Likutin Shushanim in der Papierbrigade, Wilner Bibliothek auf Strashuns Nomen. Shalom Aleichem. Man hat mir gegeben, eine Viertelstunde zu reden auf der Bibliothek, wo so gearbeitet über 40 Jahre. Es ist gleich, wie uns erzählen, ein Sachakol von der Kufe von dem Israel in Midbar mit 2 Wächtern. Matan Teure. Also will ich kennen, charakterisieren euch Strashuns Bibliothek mit 2 Wächtern, Migdash Meat. Also wie es zu die Bibliothek von Heiko Lunski. Das ist der Migdash Meat, was in ihm aufgefällt geworden und geobt gegen die Freiheit von meinem Leben. Zumal, wenn ich pflege herumgehen zwischen den Büchern, stronke und kicke auf die Sphären, was ein Gestellen also gleich und stelzschön, und der Jahren pflege ich sich mehr dachen, was das sind kein Sphären, noch größere Neshomes, lebendige Menschen stehen vor mir. Und ich pflege reden mit sie als alle lebendige und gestirtene Lenetzach Netzukim. Sachkol reden wir du auf der Thema von Guf und Nefesh und Pünktlichkeit von Stoff und Geist. Sachnazis haben geboren in Paris praktische Materialien, Konstruktions und Alpirov mit menschliche Blutgebäude. Das ist das jüdische Volk, was hat konzentriert in sich Bäuerin ganze Imperies basiert auf Moral. Und das Volk kann nicht fallen, bis zusammen es lebt. Das ist die einzige Imperie, welche kann nicht fallen, rühren, vernichten und wegen existiert auf Eubig. Und die Geistliche von dem jüdischen Volk bloß getrogen den Platz in der Wilner Bibliothek auf Strashuns Nomen, nur sie oben durchmickt Standpunkt der Schreibende Serie Werk und Euf. Also aufzugeben, sie bescherten gestellte Ozrot von dem jüdischen Volk. Als die Bibliothek ist gegründet geworden auf dem Jesod von einer reichen privaten Bibliothek von Reb Matisyahu Strashun. Matisyahu Strashun hat man gerufen wie ein Ilui, mit dem gegebenen zunehmend lebende Bibliothek. Sind die 13 Jahre der Bucherl hat genommen für eine Weib, die älteste Tochter von dem Gwir Yosef Eliogu Elischberg. Und so dämmelt ist geworden sehr vermöglich. Das hat ihm verläuft, schaffen eine gewaltige und unikale, eine ganze methodische Büchersammlung. In der Sammlung die Bibliothek hat gearbeitet von seinem Stub ganz sein Leben. Zu dem, wo seine 2 Söhne, gestorbene Junge, hat aufgeschrieben, seine Bibliothek verschrieben in Sandsavui der Vilner Kehille. Die Bibliothek ist übergegeben geworden in ein Binyan, was ist speziell ausgebaut geworden für ihr. Offiziell ist rübergegangen in dem neuen Stub am 20. Oktober 1902. Matisyahu Strashuns private Sammlung gehört 50 Bücher in hebräische Ktav-Yaden. Seine bibliothekische Pratim sind gewähnt und beschrieben in dem Katalog Liquidische Scheinem in Berlin. Zwischen sie sind gewähnt 5 in Conabulus, 300 Sphären Jordem. In den 1940 Sammlung der Bibliothek betrifft rund 15.000 Bücher. Von zwischen 13.000 katalogisierte Bücher in Arum ist es gewesen in 5.878 auf Jiddisch. Faktisch ist Strashuns Bibliothek gewesen die größte nationale jiddische Bibliothek von der ganzen Welt. In seiner Zeit sind gewesen aufgeschätzt wegen der größten Bibliophilen von der Welt und $3 Millionen. Strashuns Bibliothek ist gewesen in der Jesod zu dringliche Bibliothek für Legisierende in Wissenschaft, Literatur, was offen gewesen von Eulen a ganze Woche, Chutz, Schabbos noch Mittag. In der Salfenburger Bibliothek haben gelernt, in einem die neben jene Menschen und Freien, fromme und freie, alte und junge Talmidum und Studenten. Das Titliche hat keinmal nicht gerecht in der Bibliothek, und hat keinmal nicht gehört, kein Wort sagen, kein Vikuchim und kein Machlokes zwischen den Lernern. Die Lerner sind gewähnt von allem Spektrum von politischen Deus. In alle Kufes pflegen kommen Besucher in der Bibliothek. In 1925 Lemuschel seinen Karow zu 300 Lerner gekommen der Bibliothek jeden Tag, 100.000 bemäßigt vor einem Jahr. Der Direktor von der Bibliothek ist gewesen Strashun, Matisyahu Strashun Sakover, und zu ihm ist gearbeitet gewesen Dr. Heikel Lunsky. Sinderer ist gewesen 14 Jahre alt, ist bis zum letzten Tag von der Bibliothek und 1941. Demonstriert auch einen Professionalismus in alle zeitlichen Gebieten von der Bibliothek. Sein breiten Anquilte, sein Bescheren in hebräisch Sprach in sein gewaltige Bekijut in Sammlung vor der Bibliothek haben ihm der Gleichrecht gegeben, alle seine Lehrens, was er besucht. Zudem ist gewesen ein Schreiber, ein Journalist, ein Bibliograf, ein Büchersammler und ein Sekretär für Gesellschaft für Geschichte und Ethnographie. Lunsky, welcher gewesen übergegeben die Idee von dem Zionismus, hat sich vernommen mit Fixieren und Verarbeiten. Das gekommen zum Ausdruck seien seine Geschäfte, Tätige, seine Werk. Ausgegangen auf Hebräisch und auf Jiddisch euch. Zum Beispiel ein Buch von Vilna Jette. Strashuns Bibliothek ist gewesen ein Mocker von Stolz von Juden von Vilna. In das Zanumen ist gegangen herum der Welt. Von allen Endfeld pflegen wir kommen, schaffen auf ein Bedeutendem Ador. Obleiden, das ist gekommen in goldenem Buch, in einem Buch von Besuchern, wo sie pflegen heranstellen, in heranschreiben seine Donken. A Dankheit Lunsky quillt von dem Buch und sein Bringen, sagt Zitates von dem, weil der Buch allein ist gegangen, Leibut. Also Lemaschel, 15. Juli 1925 besuchte der jiddische Dichter, Dramaturg Leibig, der Numen von Alperen in hat geschrieben. Wo soll ich schreiben? Schweigen, das ist best. Ich bin voll mit Bewunderung. Es ist schon gesungen gewährt aus Strashuns Bibliothek, pflegt schleppen zu sehen, als Sache basiert, wo sie gegangen sind, die Ozreut. Und ich will aufstellen sich auf zwei von sie. Einer von sie ist ein Doktor, der gelernt im Institut für Jiddische Studien von der Hebräischen Universität in Jerusalem. Und der zweite ist ein Professor für Jiddische Studien. Die beiden haben gelernt sich und stark verinteressiert gewesen in der jiddischen Kunst und Kultur. Und man hat sich gebeten, arbeiten in speziellen hitlerischen Anstalten von Zucken und Bastein, einem Berobenen, in alles, wo sie eben gewollt, ist verroben der Ozrot von allen okkupierten Territorien von Europa in wegschicken das im Institut für die jiddische Frage in Frankfurt-am-Main, wo seinen Euf Alfred Rosenberg. Davke Johannes Paul, welcher verfangen geworden, in täglich gearbeitet für ein Institut, ist geschickt geworden durch die Nationalische Partei in der Lernen in der Hebräischen Universität. Und der zweite Gelernter, welchen schon gedermont ist gewesen, der Berliner Professor von Jiddischen Studies, Gorfart, während gekommen in Vilna Sommerzeit. Und 1981 hat ungeheben kleinen Informationen für jiddische Kollektionen in Museen, Bibliothek und Schulen. Wenn der Direktor von der Bibliothek, Yitzhak Strashun, hat verstanden, was die Nazisten verhaben die Bibliothek und führen sie heraus gleich, wie sie zu sehr gerecht gewesen, hat sich aufgehoben auf der Rezui von vielen. Jens, was rechtlich ist Gewissen von Strashuns Bibliothek, und das, was ist übergeblieben für uns, ist eine Sache, ein Dank für Menschen, welche pflegen registrieren von seinem Leben, die roten sie. Zwischen sie, Le Muschel, sind gewähnt Papierenbrigaden und der Direktor von dem litwischen Basichtpalaz, Bücherpalaz, Dr. Antanas Ulfis. Und euch hat Dank Lucy Davidovich, welche hat gefunden, die Bücher von Strashuns Bibliothek in Skladen von Offenbach in Deutschland. Sie hat Millionen Judaikes Hafazim übergeführt in New Yorker YIVO. Ich will mich aber sagen, dem Institut für dem YIVO-Institut für sein Aktiondigen willt in Basleuden auf der Bücher, was sie bekommen an einem Atid. Ich betrage dem Digitizing-Projekt von der Einleben in sein Leben in ein Leben in Strashuns Bibliothek, wir haben eine Deklarierung von dem in so zuschaffen, in zugeben, zu Treidlichkeit ihre Rechte zu sehen, Menschen von der ganzen Welt und von der Welt. Eltern in sehr Verstunden in Schreiben sehr Wert auf zu geben, also von dem jüdischen Volk. Ich bedanke dem Forum, welcher Arzt von Herzen von YIVO-Institut für die Möglichkeit, was hat mir gegeben, vorstellen du die Geschichte in dem Kongress von Strashuns Bibliothek. Ich sehe in der Geschichte eine nationale Poeme von der Stoff Punem Nefesh über den Guf. Und ich will verantworten mit den Wörtern, welche seinen herangeschrieben geworden durch den Schreiber und Askan Moshe Shalit und Dr. Shmuel Weiss und im Goldenen Buch. Dem 10. Mai 1933 waren in Deutschland unter Kleidung von der Musik verbrennt jüdische Bücher auf die Schutzfeld. Ihr fanatischen Narunem geht in Vilna auf den Schulhof. Kennt ihr das alles verbrennen? Ihr kennt nur unsere Körper der Griechen, ob nicht dem jüdischen Geist.
I apologize to those of you who could not follow the Yiddish for the fact that the English translation was somehow mysteriously lost. However, it will be posted on our website in due course, and you will be able to find the rest of Dr. Schor's presentation on our website. Now I want to introduce the two of the directors of the project itself, Mila Sholachova and Roberta Newman. Lyudmila is the director of our archive and library, and Roberta is the director of digital initiatives at the YIVO Institute.
So So we're actually going to reverse the order of speakers that you see in the program, and I'm going to talk first. I'm Roberta Newman, and as Jonathan said, I'm the Director of Digital Initiatives here at YIVO, and I'm going to give you an overview of the larger project in which YIVO's work with the Strashun books is taking place. Jonathan, in introducing the program, spoke a bit about it. Mine is going to be more like a show and tell with pictures here. And then afterwards, after I finish, Ludmila is going to talk specifically about how we're working to reunite the Strashun private library online. Okay, so the Edward Blank YIVO Vilna Collections Project is, as Jonathan said, an international initiative, a conservation and digitization project at 3 sites, at YIVO in New York, and at the National Library and the Lithuanian Central State Archives in Vilnius. It involves the cataloging, preservation, and digitization of not only books, but also over 1 million documents. And the project officially began in 2015 after not only all those years of discussions and negotiations that Jonathan spoke about, but also after a much more focused couple of years of trips to Lithuania and other planning. And when this project is done, the result will be the online unification of the largest pre-war Jewish collection to survive the Holocaust. So just to recap really quickly what David was talking about, because it can get a little confusing, but since we just did hear him, I don't need to go into detail about why all these books are in 3 different locations now, all these documents and books. As he noted, they were looted by the Nazis during the war, and here's a picture of some of the Jews that were forced to sort the materials at YIVO. And as he mentioned, the books and documents that were sorted there suffered 3 fates, 3 intermediary fates, let's say. Some were shipped off to Frankfurt, and some were hidden in the ghetto, and some were destroyed. And so here they are, arriving in New York in 1947, where they became the core of YIVO's collections here. YIVO had relocated to New York by then. And the crates you see there included not only books, but also hundreds of thousands of pages of documents, photos, posters, and manuscripts. And together we call all of them, along with the books, the Vilna collections. And in the years since their arrival in New York, they've been instrumental in the research of most of the leading scholars in Eastern European Jewish studies. Here is, after the war, another great picture. You see on the left, Sutzkever, with some of the materials that they pulled out of that bunker and are in the ruins of the Vilna ghetto and taking it and recovering this stuff. But as we know, the museum that they established did not have a very long life, and they themselves, fled Lithuania. Before they did so, they sent some items here to New York, to YIVO, but the rest of it was long thought to be destroyed until we cut to 40 years later, when it's learned that thousands of the Jewish books and documents were hidden here in the Church of St. George in Vilnius. And this is the building that was turned into the Lithuanian book chamber by the Soviets, and where its head librarian, Antanas Ulpis, hid many of the Jewish books and documents that had been slated for destruction. And they sat there more or less secretly for decades. And after Lithuania gained independence in 1990, this church became the bibliographic center of the National Library of Lithuania. And most of the books remained there, not all of them, but most of them remained there until just recently. So here's a picture of the interior of the church. As you can see, it was a kind of dark place full of nooks and crannies. It was a really great place to hide things. Here's another picture, and actually, I don't know how good it is, how you can see, but you can see that it's in a nave, and there are shelves of books everywhere in this church, and that's actually underneath Ludmila and one of our librarians who's working on the project there in Vilnius, Christina Dudaita. Here's another picture. It's quite a dramatic, when you go there, and you see this, it really highlights the drama of the story. So in 2015, the YIVO Vilna Collections Project officially began. And right now, YIVO is working with a team at the National Library of Lithuania to catalog, conserve, and digitize not only the remnants of the Strashun private library, the rare Hebrew books, but also Yiddish books that belong to YIVO, were at the Strashun Public Library and at other Jewish libraries before the war. They all ended up, whatever remained, ended up in that church. And the books are being cataloged by Christina Dudaita and by Lara Lempert, who you'll hear speak later. She has a dual role in our project as a librarian at the National Library and as our archivist at the Central State Archives. And this is just another picture of the books in the church. Here's an example of one book before conservation from the Strashun Library. And here you see a book being conserved in the state-of-the-art laboratory, conservation lab at the National Library. And here's one after digitization. We've already been receiving shipments of digital files here in New York in the last year or so. Here's another example. One exciting development is that as of this past fall, all of the books are now no longer in that moldering atmospheric church, which is being given back to the community in Vilnius, but they're in the brand new National Library of Lithuania, which is a really spectacular building, and also a much nicer climate-controlled place, to keep rare books. So the project in Lithuania involves not only books, but also the digitization of documents. And among the materials hidden in the church for decades were thousands of pages of letters, manuscripts, and other documents that had once been part of YIVO's collections. And those materials are now housed at the Lithuanian Central State Archives. And even before the official start of the project in 2015, Lara began work on the documents. A room was set aside in the Central State Archives for Lara to work on sorting and arranging documents, and they really needed to be sorted and arranged. What you see there is actually after some sorting and arrangement, but though not their final arrangement, you have to understand that these materials were all jumbled together. Jumbled together, and they were piled in kind of moldering heaps. I didn't see this because this is before things were cleaned up back in the 80s and 90s when people from YIVO began to first go to Lithuania to see the materials. They were piled in moldering heaps in the basement of the church and in a complete jumble. And here you can get a glimpse of the original condition of the documents, and this isn't even the worst case of a dirty, crumpled pages. But they are now also being conserved as well as sorted and arranged. And this is a picture taken in December of a conservator at work in the Central State Archives. The papers are cleaned and flattened. That's the primary thing that we do with them. Sometimes they're repaired if they're really ripped up before they get digitized. Here's an example of a document that has already been digitized. It's a page from a report about children's games in Kolki, Poland, which was sent to YIVO's ethnography division in 1938 by a volunteer Sammler, that is a volunteer collector for YIVO. Here's another something that hasn't yet been digitized. It's the manuscript for a Yiddish play entitled Die Mischugene Eus Liebe, or Crazy for Love. And there are many theater materials in the Vilna collections here and also in Lithuania. And this is an original play manuscript. So at the same time that we're working in Lithuania, we're also working here in New York on refining the cataloging and on conservation and digitization of the materials that got shipped here from Frankfurt in 1947. And in the library alone, the goal is to digitize about 1.25 million pages. The first books we focused on for digitization were the Strashun books. And a year and a half into the project, actually, I'm happy to say that that part of the work has largely been completed. And the efforts of many people have gone into making that possible. We have a great team. We also have a very good vendor that we hired. We did exhaustive research on what would be the best way and the most efficient and cost-effective way to digitize the materials, and we found a vendor that could do it for us very quickly and very well. So here's a book being scanned on a flatbed scanner. Here's another picture of a book on a flatbed scanner. But the decisive thing is that we also have a high-speed robotic scanner that can handle all but the most fragile books. And that's allowed us to digitize the books much more quickly than originally thought possible. What we thought would take 6 years is really getting done in about 2 years. But other parts of the project go on because you can't do them as quickly, can't do everything super fast. Actually, digitizing is like a faster part of it. The intellectual work that goes into cataloging and also the work that goes into conserving is actually a much more long process. So just as in Lithuania, there's a parallel project here to also digitize documents. And we think that publishing millions of pages of these documents on the internet is going to actually help revolutionize the study of Jewish history in Eastern Europe, allowing scholars to make new connections between documents that have been separated, but now by doing searches, you may be able to make all kinds of connections that you were not able to before. And it's a mass of, its entire archive, really, that will be going online. And also, we think it's the biggest Yiddish, it will be the biggest Yiddish collection of materials on the internet as well, though there are many, many languages represented in these collections. So here's an election poster from Poland from the 1920s or 30s, urging people to vote for the Jewish Labor Bund. There's a tremendous variety of what's to be found in the Vilna collections. Here's a drawing depicting Red Army troops ousting capitalists and other enemies of the Russian Revolution. And it's from a handmade Yiddish book from a Jewish orphanage in Bershad, Ukraine in 1924. If you pick up any piece of paper from the Vilna collections, you'll learn something you never even imagined about Jewish life. There are a lot of surprises. This is a document from the papers of the eminent Jewish historian Shimon Dubnov about the massacres of Jews that occurred during the Cossack Rebellion, the Khmelnytsky Uprising, in 1648 to 1657. And here is just taking things at random. This is a Tarbut Hebrew Teachers Seminary identity card for one Chaim Kravitsa from Vilna in 1922. And we also have extensive music collections. We mentioned theater collections, also extensive collections. This is a piece of sheet music. And here's an infographic showing what the project has accomplished so far. And as you can see, we're well along the way in a project that is in year 2 of a 7-year schedule. The thing, of course, we're furthest ahead with is in the digitization of books, especially here in New York, because actually almost all of these books had already been cataloged by YIVO. Years and years of work have already been spent prior to this project in making the Strashun Library available to researchers. So we didn't have to catalog books, we could just start right in on digitizing, but we needed to do a little more work to tighten up the arrangement and organization of the archival documents. We've also begun to develop the project website, which I invite you to visit and explore. Later this year, we will have exhibitions up on the Strashun Library and also on the Esther Rachel Kaminska Theater Museum, which is one of the Vilna collections we're working on. And next summer, this coming summer, we expect to be able to launch the search portal that will allow you to access and explore the books and documents we've digitized, and that will be added to over the years as we continue work. And we're also working on projects to create educational resources to help teachers use these primary sources in programs here and in Lithuania, but more about that some other time. Just stay tuned. Thanks very much. Let me just get this for Mila. Oops. I'm actually just trying to switch it to Mila's presentation, but I can't do it, it seems. Maybe someone will come and help. Okay. Can't make the mouse.
Before Mila speaks, I do want to add just two notes to Robbie's presentation. And the first is that when I entered the church for the first time to see what it looked like, on the one hand, there were the Jewish materials, which were, of course, of the most interest. But when I glanced up, I saw these images of the cherubim and of Jesus Christ himself, who had been looking down at these Jewish materials since they were stored there in 1947. And I really thought to myself, this is such an amazing project. And this gives a kind of iconography to that, because it truly is a project that could not have been accomplished without the help of many people, Jews and non-Jews. Antanas Ulpis, the Lithuanian librarian who saved these materials from the Soviets, risked his life to do so for no reward whatsoever. And he died in 1987, a year or two before any word was made public about what was his great accomplishment. So he never knew what became of the work that he started. And so many in the history of YIVO do not know of this project, and I often reflect on that, on the sacrifices of those, and we've heard about many of them who preceded myself and all of us here, who risked their lives, who perished, who never knew what would become of these materials. So in addition to conducting this project in the most professional way possible, I believe, and the YIVO staff believes, and the Board of Trustees believes, that there is a true moral responsibility that goes along with this, a responsibility to the Jewish people for their preservation. I also want to say just one thing, that these million plus documents that we're going to be putting online are going to be put online, and scholars will be able to make use of them for the most part. But they are in Yiddish, they are in Hebrew, they are in Polish, they are in Russian, they are Ukrainian, in Lithuanian, and God knows what other languages, German, some are in French, which means that for the average American reader, or the average Russian reader, or the average Chinese reader, they will be completely inaccessible. And so our aim is to get scholars to curate, as I said in my opening remarks, galleries of materials that will lead the general public through selections of materials that will be translated, that will be put in context, and will be made understandable by the majority of people. So Alyssa Quint is our first scholar. She is working on the Esther Rachel Kaminska Theater materials, as Robbie mentioned, and we are very grateful for an anonymous grant that has enabled us to do that. Thank you. Mila?
So I'm going to talk specifically about the Strashun Private Library digitization project that is happening now in the YIVO library. And I will focus on how we actually planned this project, how we made it happen, and I'm just trying to start my PowerPoint. Okay. Okay. So digital reconstruction of the Strashun Library is the essential integral part of the Edward Blank YIVO Vilna Collections project. The fact that after World War II, YIVO in New York inherited significant part of the Strashun Library, including many books from the Matisyahu Strashun private collection, was well known for years in the circle of book historians, librarians, bibliophiles, and historians of Lithuanian and Polish Jewry. But the true inspiration behind the Strashun Library project was the news that the matching part of this marvelous collection survived and was identified as a remarkable and sizable whole at the Martynas Mažvydas Lithuanian National Library. Reconstruction of the Strashun Library became a key component of the Edward Blank Vilna Collections project, yet in the planning stages in 2013-2015. The news that the surviving part arrived in the end of 2012 with a detailed list of books, with the books identified as the books from the Strashun private library, compiled by Lara Lempert, the bibliographer at the Lithuanian National Library. Lara, who had been working on this list for several years, discovered the books while working on sorting and organizing the Hebrew and Yiddish collections in St. George Church, where the Judaica department of the National Library was located. Lara and I immediately thought that both parts of this unique historical collection shall be reunited digitally. We found an ardent support in Jonathan Brandt, whose vision and energy further inspired the YIVO and the Lithuanian teams and all project developments in America and in Europe. My personal introduction to the Strashun Library began with the catalog of the YIVO exhibit on Matisyahu Strashun and his library that took place in YIVO in 2001. That exhibit was organized and curated by Aviva Ostrinsky, then the head librarian of the YIVO Institute. The catalog served as an important source of information on the collection and a research guide in shaping the current project guidelines. We began discussing the logistics of the Strashun project in 2013. Where shall we start? And how do we make it happen? Luckily, the key to the project was on the surface. Likutei Shoshanim, a printed catalog of the Strashun private library published in Berlin in 1889, became our point of departure. It was decided to create an enhanced electronic version of the Likutei Shoshanim in order to make possible identifying the books in the YIVO library catalog. Electronic database that took months and months of intellectually challenging, meticulous, but engaging work was completed by the young librarian Mariah Kennedy, later joined by the intern and now YIVO archivist Jessica Podgorzer. It became much more than a simply convenient searchable tool for the Likutei Shoshanim. This is how just small fraction of this huge database that the team of YIVO librarians have accomplished in order to make the project possible. So what did we do? The YIVO librarians, they checked all Likutei Shoshanim entries against the OCLC World Catalog, the world's most comprehensive database about library collection. We actually checked all the names and all titles in this enhanced database, and we actually found the standard names and the standard transliteration for all titles in order to continue our search and actually in order to verify all holdings and verify how correct our cataloging entries are. And we use romanization rules of the Library of Congress and authority files of the Library of Congress actually to make it happen, to make it possible. We also checked Likutei Shoshanim catalog against the YIVO online catalog and identified all relevant holdings and call numbers. We found many typos in Likutei Shoshanim and some errors. So it's actually that also was included in our work. Additionally, we identified libraries in the United States, Europe, and Israel that may have copies of the books listed in Likutei Shoshanim, but missing from both YIVO and the Lithuanian National Library holdings. And we also identified the books if they have been digitized anywhere in the world, and we check the level of access, how accessible they are, and we also check the quality of images in order to make our images representations compatible. Really just to make sure that we do a better job, or at least we do a good job to the best of our ability. So we created the we also created a similar Excel database for the books that were found in Lithuania and incorporated this information into the consolidated Strashun master list. And the master list is now serving as the main database for all other processes that are associated with the project, such as keeping track on the pre-digitization procedures, on scanning, on quality control, on delivery of the materials after digitization, and on ingest into the digital management system. This database gives us even more. We imagine large goals for the master list. It may serve as a key tool for the next stage of the project. Search for the books that are missing in both New York and Vilnius. When we finish our job here in a couple of years, we envision that we probably will search for the books that are still missing. At least for the books, maybe not the same copies, but maybe exactly it's the same copies, not from Strashun Private Library, but exactly the same editions. So what was the philosophy behind the project? Philosophy was a little bit larger than just digitization project. we see it as a reconstruction, the Strashun Private Library, as a temple of knowledge, as a way that ancient temples destroyed by cataclysm and wars are being rebuilt. So philosophy behind the project was quite straightforward, but larger than simply digitization. So the first step was, of course, to find as many original Strashun books listed in Likutei Shoshanim as possible. That was the first step. And I will tell you more how we accomplished that. Then we also saw our goal and see our goal in reconstructing the content of Likutei Shoshanim catalog by including exactly the same copies of the editions listed in Likutei Shoshanim, only when the original copies are not available. And by doing so, we recognize other valuable collection of books and their owner that originated in Vilna but were destroyed and dispersed during World War II and after World War II. That's our philosophy. Implementation of the project. So it was difficult, and I will tell you more. Of course, we were looking for the books with this stamp. But first, we had to check the status of cataloging of the Strashun Library collection. And actually, to learn the cataloging system developed by Chaim Lieberman, who was a cataloger of the rabbinical collection at YIVO in the 1960s, 1970s. So the Strashun Private Library is a part of the YIVO larger rabbinical books collection. And this private library section has never been really segregated. And the rabbinical books collection is, in its turn, is a part of the YIVO Vilna collections, like YIVO Prewar Vilna collections. And this part had been cataloged, rabbinical section, as I said, by Rabbi Chaim Lieberman, and he was a famous bibliographer and librarian of 6th Lubavitcher Rebbe. Rabbi Lieberman developed a complicated zoological arrangement of the collection by genre, and he developed a special call number system that incorporated Hebrew characters, numbers, and additional characters. And so by itself, the system is very intricate and difficult. Since his huge efforts, the rabbinical collection had been well arranged and quite easy to navigate once you learn the system. However, apparently he did not finish the enormous cataloging project, and while many books were assigned the call numbers, some of them remained uncatalogued for years for a variety of reasons. Because they were bound, and only first book was catalogued, and the rest, like 4 other books bound together, were not catalogued, and otherwise we would never find them unless we actually open this book and start browsing the page. That was a real challenge. Then there were also separate uncatalogued books with assigned call numbers, and it was also a challenge because there was a call number, but there were no record, neither on the card nor online, of course. If it's not on the card, it's not online. So, but the books were standing on the shelves with the labels and looking like they're cataloged, but they're actually not. So that was additional challenge. There was also a lot of books that were not cataloged and they were never assigned call numbers. So we did that. That was a huge job. So we discovered this challenge very quickly and decided to begin the search for additional books with a Strashun Library stamp, as you see it, by literally opening each single book in the stack. So we went through dozens of thousands of books. I'm telling you, it was very difficult. So I would say that YIVO staff displayed a true commitment and enthusiasm in achieving the goal. And I would like to thank Vital Zaiko, YIVO information manager, who took most of this difficult and dirty job upon himself. So, and indeed, we found hundreds of additional books with a stamp, and they were immediately cataloged and sent for digitization. So, and also we found many books that had a stamp, but were not listed in Likutei Shoshanim. And it's also additional challenge. So if you go to the exhibit, you'll find the Likote Shoshanin copy of the catalog with Heikel Lunsky's personal remarks, and you'll see the call numbers against each of the position in the catalog. And you will also see the inserts in the catalog with additional entries. So that catalog was not all-inclusive. So there were more books that were not actually either arrived later or either for some reason didn't get into the catalog, we don't know. And I think the same situation is in Lithuania, and I know that Lara, actually, our Lithuanian colleagues were also very, very hardworking and dedicated, and they did enormous. We say that we had a dirty job here, but they displayed the real heroism there, because our books were relatively clean. The books over there were very dirty and with a lot of dust. So, as Robbie said, digitization of the books had been carried out with the Smooth Solutions company in close collaboration with the YIVO staff on 2 different scanners, manual and robotic, and in order to accommodate the fragile condition of the books in different size and shape. And digitization was followed by the rigorous and painstaking quality control, digital preservation protocol, and ingest protocol, which will make books available online very soon. And the books will be incorporated in the digital assets management system. This is how the books look after digitization. You can see the inserts, these are tags, and if you look even closer, you'll see that there is an inscription on each of the tags saying if this is original book with the Strashun stamp or not. So we're going to reflect that also in our metadata so people don't get confused. So that is the thing. And then these are a few samples of the books that have been cataloged. And so far, we go back to the statistic. Yes, so I'm just repeating what Robbie had said, that we actually were planning to digitize 2,500 books from the original Strashun collection here, but in reality, we ended up by digitizing more books because there were many hidden bound books, and I think that we're almost finished, but as we do quality control, we discover more bound books, and we catalog them, and we enhance the metadata, so we'll probably end up by digitizing at least 3,000 books in this portion of the collection, and the counterpart of the project is now 1,300 books, not 1,200, even more, because the librarians still keep finding more books with the Strashun stamp. So as we work on the project, it develops by itself, because it motivates us to find for more books, to look for more books. And we also anticipate the next stage of the project with participation with the National Library of Israel, who already expressed interest in the project. And we will probably go and look for more books, and the project will continue. Thank you very much.
Well, I have a couple of comments also about following Mila's presentation and before I introduce Lara. And this has to do, first of all, with what Mila alluded to, which is that we are ingesting these electronic files into data management system. And that process involves a partnership between YIVO and the Center for Jewish History. So I'm very grateful for the Center for Jewish History in making their facilities available to us for this final stage of the project. I do want to mention that in the very initial stages of discussions about this project, when I first met with the director of the National Library of Lithuania, and I said we were interested in not only digitizing the archives, but also books, he said, "What books?" I said, "Well, the books that have a YIVO stamp or are connected to the Strashun Library." He made a quick call to his chief librarian, and the chief librarian said, "Well, there may be 6 or 7 such books." And today, as you just heard, we're going to be digitizing close to 3,000 of these books. And so this project is not just a static project, but it is also a project of discovery. And just as we have discovered more books than we ever thought we might find in Lithuania, we have also discovered books in our own library here, as Mila was saying, books that were hidden because they were bound into volumes and therefore not cataloged, books that simply were ignored for 70 years. And so there is much material that is coming to light as a consequence of this project. In addition to the books, there are now documents that we have discovered in other institutions in Lithuania, as well as in the National Library, which we had not known about at the beginning of this project. And that's why a larger project to digitize all of the extant Jewish documents in Eastern Europe is one that I think, however well we think we know what is in these collections, will yield tremendous surprises in the future. Now it is my real pleasure to introduce Dr. Laura Lempert, someone who is extremely dear to us here at YIVO, someone without whom this project literally could not happen. As I have been told again and again and again and again by my Lithuanian informants, she is the only person in Lithuania who can actually do this project. She knows Hebrew, she knows Yiddish, she knows the history, she knows the context, she is the link to a tradition, and she is one of our great assets. Laura?
Thank you, Jonathan, for this, of course, tremendously complimentary and untrue presentation. I may assure you I don't know not all, but not all which is needed for that project. But I'm learning. This day of learning for me, for being here, is a tremendous treasure. Really, what I heard from the presentation is really so valuable. I'm so happy to be here. And my presentation from the beginning could maybe seem a bit off, because I will speak of one collision, of one, the first part actually would belong to the first panel, but the second one is really belonging to this, and I hope to make this clear in the course of presentation. For a proper evaluation of the remnants of the Strashun Library collection that the Lithuanian National Library inherited, and I choose this term as most neutral, since the discussion of the legal aspects is beyond the scope of my presentation. 2 periods of the Soviet rule of Lithuania are crucial. First, the brief, albeit highly consequential one in 1940, actually from July 21st, and the period between the 1944 and the new independence of Lithuania in 1990. Of course, a thorough research in that field is being conducted and will be presented in the upcoming book of David Fishman, and part of that we heard today, a small part. For my part, I intend to concentrate on two groups of documents that hold a special importance for the history of the library. And those documents, to be clear, are not among those newly found documents. They have been in the archives for years, and they were processed because they are not Jewish documents. They are Lithuanian documents. One group, one set of documents preserved in Lithuanian State archives pertains to the liquidation of Vilna's Jewish community and appropriation of its possessions by Soviet authorities. And the second set, the second group, now in the same archives, but transferred there from the original depository, the archives of Lithuanian Academy of Science. This group is specifically devoted to the fate of the Strashun Library as an institution. In my brief presentation, I will attempt to show how these documents inform the situation of the part of the Strashun Library preserved within the holdings of the Lithuanian National Library. The folder on the liquidation of the Jewish community actually uses the term liquidation as in liquidity, because it speaks of the institutions of the community as of material belongings. Among those belongings was the Strashun Library and Matisyahu Strashun Library as well, and the Ansky Museum of the Jewish Historical Ethnographic Society, the three institutions which were already mentioned together alongside each other today. On the 16th of September of 1940, the decree was issued about the transfer of the library under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Education, or it was at the time called Commissariat of People's Education. The measure was applied by David Schweilich, who acted on behalf of the head of the city and region of Vilnius, to whom Schweilich reported about the finishing of the transaction already on the 30th of September. The documents don't comment on the status of the library staff, although the decree is in its first line requires, and I quote, to dismiss all the community workers. The new supervisor of the liquidated Vilnius Jewish Community Libraries and the museum, on behalf of the ministry, was appointed Yudel Anilovich. One wonders why Jews were appointed for those functions. Was there an intention to further maintain and preserve or conserve in some form or other this Jewish heritage, which would require some qualification, of course? Or was it simply the matter of better evaluation of the material worth of the belongings, in which knowing Jewish languages would come handy? Of special interest in this folder is the document of the transfer signed by both Schweilich and Anilovich, which contains a classified list of the books, among them 5,478 in Yiddish, 13,075 books in Hebrew, 3,800 books in German, and books in other languages. The curiosities that there was listed one Arabic book and 2 Lithuanian books. There is also in that list a line for, and I quote, the old book according to the catalog Likutei Shoshanim. And the figure given there is 753 books, as well as 20,000 uncatalogued books, among them 15,000 named by double copies. They are also listed, and total amount is also given. So the situation when Soviet takes over the library as a community institution shows us actually the last portrait of the library in its entirety, when nothing yet was done to it. The documents of the transfer include also the whole inventory of the library, up to a bottle of ink. But there is no mention of the further use of the library or intentions how they should use it, or there is also no mentioning of moving its contents. that another set of documents begins on the 33rd October by a letter of the Secretary of the Ministry of Education to the head of the Institute of Lithuanian Studies. This institution actually exists now under the name the Institute of Lithuanian Literature and Folklore. I would like, with your permission, to quote that short letter in full. And please bear in mind that there are two Lithuanian institutions, Soviet Lithuanian institutions, in exchange. There are no Jewish person in that exchange. Upon gathering information about the former Strashun Library, the Committee for Adult Education came to a conclusion that the library, as one of the biggest Judaic libraries in Europe, having many rarities, incunabula, and manuscripts, cannot be open for the general public, but should be transferred to the Institute as a resource for study and research. We asked the Institute to take the library into its custody from Comrade Anilovich, the same Anilovich who was its possessor on behalf of the Soviet authorities. Since there is no special mention of incunabula and manuscripts in the earlier documentation of the library transfer, so we must come to conclusion that the content this information as to the content of the library and its high evaluation must have come not from Anilovich, but from another source which is undisclosed in the folder of the documents. But later in December, the same secretary have written to the head of the Institute about the changed decision. The library now was to function as a public library, and the Institute was to leave some books of less academic value for using it. In other words, the Institute should make the division, leave for itself, for its own usage, the academic books or the books of high academic value, and the less valuable books should be given to the as a lending library. So who would be the persons who would be in charge for that expertise and who could make the decision, actually? Also, the question is, for making this, the library should be physically divided, at least in two parts. At that stage, one Grigory Vershupsky, in one part, some documents, it's just Grigory Vershupsky, and other part is Dr. Grigory Vershupsky, but I think it's a medical doctor, not as a PhD doctor, of course, of humanities. Some Grigory Vershupsky was engaged for that expertise and presented its results in two parts. In one document of the November of 1940, he presented the 5 incunabula, the same incunabula which were mentioned here, precisely the same, with short explanations, and also he presented the list of, as he called it, olden writings and other interesting editions, 26 in total. And later in the same month, he also presented his more expanded conclusions. And the conclusions were, the resume of these conclusions was such that the books of scientific value should be divided between YIVO, books of theology and religion, the Institute of Education, which is a Lithuanian institution, books on philosophy and pedagogical content, and Vilnius University Library or some medical institute, books of medical studies. So this Vershupsky presented an idea of dividing the library in just more parts than it was initially planned. There is no indication in the folder as if the Institute or the authorities of any kind had acted on Grigory Vershupsky's advice. The only clue that the library continued to function in some capacity is an undated list of the library personnel, 5 workers, including the librarians Isaac Strashun and Heiko Lunsky, who, as the document states, had not been paid their salary from the 1st of October, that is from the next day after the liquidation of the community. So they were not fired, actually, but also not paid. They were in such limbo. and their fate was not decided. Comparing the figures from those documents with the ones from the Rosenberg Squad reports, also some of them are also in Lithuania and some of them here in YIVO, that gives the number of volumes of the Strashun Library in one document as 40,000 and other documents as 50,000 volumes. I would suggest that the Strashun Library was not, in fact, not only divided, but even not moved. And when Hermann Krug writes in his diary on that stage when he has no access to the smaller ghetto and the library, as they say, stays abandoned and sealed, and after several days he wrote that it is not still sealed already, but still abandoned. It shows that the library stood there and maybe except of the incunabula still had most of its books before Nazis plundered them. So the books that survived the war, either in New York or in Vilnius, many of them are of religion. We know that many of them are of that same content, religious, theological, or philosophical nature, also seem to strengthen the view that they had remained a part of the collection of holdings of the Strashun Library till the Nazis' invasion and their purge, in Hermann Krug's word, of the library. Maybe it was just a matter of shortage of time. The Soviet period was really very short, that no decision was reached by the institutions involved. Such view would be consistent with the fact that not one book with the library stamp, be it of Strashun personal collection or the general stamp of the Strashun Library, was found in the Institute of Lithuanian Literature and Folklore. In fact, there are no Jewish books there, not at all. And for that matter, those books in those stamps were not found in other Lithuanian libraries and institutions. And we checked that, although maybe if we want to check to establish this fact for 100%, another more thorough search should be continued. But anyway, it wouldn't be dozens, it wouldn't be hundreds. Maybe it would be a book or two, a copy or two. Therefore, the National Library of Lithuania would appear to be the only, the only depository in Lithuania that has in its holdings the remnants of the Strashun Library, and as such could help reconstruct to a possible extent this remarkable collection, to participate in the reconstruction which Mila presented in her talk. This is a treasured legacy at the library and a great responsibility, of course. The Vilna project initiated and maintained by, which was initiated and maintained now by YIVO, provides an excellent vehicle for that goal, and the National Library of Lithuania is extremely proud to be a partner of it. As it was said, the work was began there earlier, on earlier stage, just to locate and record the books, but it was actually was no goal in itself. It was just a part of everyday work of the librarians, and now it became a part of the bigger picture, and we are very happy because of that. Although methods for working with the parts of the collection in Vilnius and New York differ in some aspects, which is inevitable, both teams remind of tunnel workers, which will eventually meet one another in the middle, as the documents themselves and the books themselves, that, as we know from the experience in that project, already it was proven that one part of the document was found in YIVO and another part of the same document was found in Vilnius. The same is with books and their parts. So I would just give a short summary about the Matisyahu Strashun, not so much summary as update. What is the status of the collection now? First of all, and this is an exciting news for us, we had a permission and we separated the collection physically. Now this collection is not among other holdings. It has its separate place in this new building, in these new facilities, and can be accessed as an entity. And now, for now, the list, which is going to be updated yet, has 1,380 books and 210 issues of periodicals. Among both groups, there are second copies, as appears, Matisyahu Strashun had several copies of some of the editions. There is also the curiosity of the books, which bears the Strashun stamp of his personal library, but actually are of later date, and we don't include the books in the list, but we do note them because the stamping of the books, of such books, just gives us light for the work of the custodians of the collection and the librarians who worked with it. And actually this copy of Likutei Shoshanim, which is on display now on the exhibit, bears the same stamp, which is actually anachronical, but very interesting case. We also have such cases in Vilnius. And this figure is not final in any, maybe it is more or less final, but not totally final, because I regret to say that because of the lack of human intellectual personnel, the library still has unprocessed books, and not rather many of them, and maybe another discoveries are possible. And also what is specific to Vilnius, which is not included officially in the framework of the project, we still hope to come with additional data, as YIVO Institute does. For example, I compile a list of Heiko Lunsky personal collection within the holdings of the Lithuania Library, not only because of his importance of a figure, but also because he was donator of part of the books for the Strashun Library. So some of the books bears two stamps, his personal stamp and the stamp of the library. Also, I'm very interested in other donators whose names are very well known, because most of them began to donate books, taking an example from Matisyahu Strashun himself, and their names are known to that audience very well. I don't need to mention them. Maybe some, the father and son Finns, and father and sons bibliographers, Ben Jacobs and others. But what we do, we separate and locate those books, because there are also two stamps, their personal stamp and also the stamp of the library. Also, such collectors as Marcon, for example, had a very specific habit, I would say, to mention all the books, if there were several books bound in one, to mention all the books which are bound on the first page. And it is a great help, because not all of the bounded books survived, but we know what was there originally. So those scraps of knowledge, I hope, would be useful for the project, for that bigger picture, for that reconstruction which was presented today. And I would like to conclude by expressing my personal gratitude for being involved in this work that is at the same time a memorial to the past and securing of the community of Jewish culture and intellectuality in the future. And I also grateful to my many mentors. Some of them are regretfully not with us today. There are people who just were forced in Lithuania, who spoke of those treasures and wrote on them, and also cooperated with YIVO Institute researching those treasures. Those are Israel Lampert and Fira Bramson, both of blessed memory, who also taught me about these books, and they continue to teach me even now because I study the documents that they gathered, and reading what they have written, I learn a lot. And also for all the colleagues in YIVO, which at some point began to look at their Lithuanian colleagues as equal, intellectually equal, which was sadly lacked for several decades, and was now we have a greater motivation to continue the work, which we did anyway, but now it's for entirely new perspective and as a part of international team, and I'm very grateful for that. Thank you for your attention.
We've gone a little bit over our time, but I hope that you will stay for the Q&A, a very short Q&A, and then a reception will follow. Yeah. One thing I'd like to say that has not been said about Lara's work is that when she finally managed to put all of the materials, all of the documents together in that needed to be conserved, it was discovered that there was approximately 53,000 documents, pages of documents that required conservation work. And this has been an unbelievable job on the part of Lara and her assistants to make sense out of this mass of materials. Anyway, let's, if anyone has any questions, please do ask.
I actually want to add something
Yep.
to that we didn't get a chance to say, is that we're, as David Fishman was saying before, each piece of paper, each book is really an artifact with its own history. So we made the decision early in the project that even if, let's say, there was another copy of this book elsewhere that had been digitized, if we have the original book that was in the Strashun Library, we're going to digitize that book. Whether or not, I mean, sometimes in some cases, it really is an artifact. There are not only there are stamps of former owners from before it even came to Strashun, and also inscriptions. Some of them very interesting. So that's another aspect of the project. Mm-hmm. You know, of course, where there isn't, if there isn't a surviving book, we'll look for another copy first of that edition, you know, to rebuild Likutei Shoshanim.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I have a question for the three on the right and for one on the left. For the three on the right, did I understand correctly, or will you make me understand correctly, that you found between you Lunsky's own inventory of the Strashun collection, which he actually, according to Israel Klausner, submitted to the library at one point?
Apparently we did. Apparently we did, and it is now
Mila,
on
hold
display.
it up.
It is now on display on the exhibit, apparently.
Very good.
Because that's interesting because it has all his handwritten notes, cataloging notes, and then cataloging call numbers, and then we actually, the same call number is seen on all the original Strashun books. It's the same number and the same handwriting. So it's like almost 95% his own copy. And there are also pages, additional pages, handwritten pages with additional entries that he later added to the printed version of the Likutei Shoshanim. It's on display.
I'm looking forward to seeing it. Dr. Flo,
excuse me, I must add that I don't know why, but Lunsky apparently worked on several copies. There are many copies of Likutei Shoshanim left in Vilnius, and at least one belonged to him and bears his manuscript notes, and the other doesn't bear Lunsky's stamp as an owner, but also with those inscriptions. So I think that he just used the copies as a working material, because everybody wrote and Dr. Shaw wrote about that he worked on cataloging system and always developed the cataloging system and the work was never finished. So yes, we don't have this kind of added pages, manuscript pages, but the copy which was in Lunsky's belonging, yes, this is in Vilnius.
Yeah, apparently there were a few copies that he used to have and actually work with them.
Very good. Dr. Shaw, קודם כל will ich sagen, dass ich habe sehr nur gehabt von einer Bier. Ich rede nicht von der Rede, auch von der Rede, aber von einer Bier. Es ist ein gewaltig Werk, und ich darf sagen, dass man darf das übersetzen auf Englisch, weil es ist sehr, sehr wichtig. Aber das ist nicht meine Frage. Die Frage ist, ihr habt gebringt beim Unheil von einer Rede ein Zitat von Lunsky. Wenn ich gedenke richtig, von Lunsky. Von wann hat genommen dem Zitat? Ist das von seinem Essay von 1935?
Von dem goldenen Buch, in dem goldenen Buch, was ist gegangen, Leibot, hat geschrieben ein Titel. In dem Titel haben wir bekommen von dem Titel, was ist ja übergeblieben, eine Sachfrage, was sie gewohnt beschreibt in dem Buch.
Ist Lunsky hat das reingeschrieben beim Unheil von dem Buch?
Von dem Buch. Von dem goldener Buch. Der goldene Buch ist gewesen ein Buch von den Menschen, was wir besiegt in der Bibliothek von der ganzen Welt.
Aber das existiert nicht? Existiert ja oder nicht?
Der goldene Buch ist gegangen, Leibut, es registriert nicht. Wir wissen, ein Teil von dem, ein Heilig von dem, von einem Artikel von Lunsky.
Von Kleusner. Auch von Lunsky.
Von Lunsky.
Von Lunsky.
Lunsky hat geschrieben Artikel in zwei langen Sprachen, auf Jiddisch und auf Hebräisch, und es ist übergeblieben für uns.
Sehr gut, Dank.
I don't think it was mentioned. How many of these 6,000 books is this the only copy of this book? Or are all these, do we have other in the world, I'm talking? Is there any of these 6,000 that are the only extant copy? So just to get an idea of what.
That's a very good question. Actually, well, we checked all entries in Likutei Shonim against the WorldCat catalog to just identify how rare they are, how many other repositories have the same book, and it can be different. It's difficult to say. Some libraries have none of them like actually exceptionally rare. There are some other copies of the books in other, like British Library or Harvard, Jewish Theological Seminary. They're still quite rare. I would say on average 3-4 other repositories have the same book, but they are distinguished libraries. It's not like you can find this book in every single library. It's only really still very distinguished. Could be British Library, it could be Bodleian Library or Jewish Theological Seminary. New York Public Library has a very nice collection, or Bibliotheca Rosenthalia in Amsterdam. So we're still in this very strong group of libraries with distinguished rabbinical collections. And I would say that basically when we complete this project, we would probably we can state that maybe we shall join this group of distinguished rabbinical libraries, because I think the YIVO role in YIVO library role in rabbinical libraries was a little bit underestimated. Of course, we cannot claim, we don't have incunabulas, we don't have like really rarities, but it's still essential. And I think we probably can compete. We'll see. We'll see. And I think Brett Hill wants to comment on this.
One of the lines that I crossed out in the Hollywood Diamond when I was shortening my paper is that whereas if you look up, for example, novels by Philip Roth or John Cheever or Toni Morrison in WorldCat, you will find hundreds of copies of these novels in libraries in North America. If you look up any given item in Likutei Shoshanim, in general, you will not find it in more than 4 or 5 or 6 libraries in all of North America, if you will find it in that many libraries, as well as, of course, the British Library, the Bodleian, the Rosentaliana, maybe 1 or 2 other European libraries, aside from the National Library of Israel. So it gives you a sense of relatively how rare these books are in the context of book lore. One wouldn't necessarily say they're rarissima, like a book in a unique copy in the Valmadonna Library, and there are many books that are unique there, but they are certainly almost in their entirety rariora, rather rare books, and indeed there are a few of them, as Lunsky himself said, which are unique copies in the world. And another mention that I left out in my paper was a Prague edition from 1590, which has the first recorded writing by a Jewish publisher in Yiddish. I contacted the world expert in Prague printing in the Czech Republic about it. She knew only of the copy in the Bodleian Library, aside from the Strashun copy. So it gives you a sense of how relatively rare these books are, even among the most common ones.
Thank you.
Just to add, is we can look at the books individually and their value individually, but as an aggregate, we also have the opportunity here to study the library of a maskil, of an inherent of the Haskalah, in its total. And that's another way to look at this. Among the items that we're digitizing in Lithuania, and Lara would know more in detail about this, are also the card catalogs and the records of who borrowed what book from a whole bunch of libraries in the Vilna area. I think in the beginning of the project, even a couple people questioned, well, that doesn't sound very important, but it is. It's a window on what people read. I mean, I think that Jeffrey Weidlinger was talking before about what people borrowed from Russian libraries, and they happen to be a lot of Jews, so now we have some idea of what Jews are reading, but we don't have the same kind of intact records for the Jewish libraries or the print runs for the Jewish books. So it's a little hole, and maybe these cards, will go some way towards filling that hole.
Anyone else? Good. Okay, one more. Last.
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. Is anyone keeping track of how many books in the Strashun collection belong to Matisyahu's father? Was a notable person in his own right?
Shmuel Strashun?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, no, I have no answer. I don't even know.
We recorded one such book among the surviving Vilnius books. Only one. And I now don't have the exact title of the book.
Someone would need to really read all marginalia to identify all these things.
Please
There's
join
at least
us.
one that I saw here.
Please join us for a reception. Thank you all very, very much for coming. Thank you to all of our participants.